If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that humans will believe almost anything. On Blasphemy with Chris and Marnee, we take a look at some of these beliefs, uncover their very human origins, how they've developed and changed over time, and the very real consequences they had in society and culture. Impacts that continue even today in our lives. Welcome to Blasphemy. My name is Chris and with me as always is my beautiful, beautiful life partner, wife, best friend, everything, Marnee. How you doing?
Good.
It's the Sunday before Christmas. And so our life has changed drastically recently for the better. And whoo, man, it feels good. Yeah. And we have space in our lives to actually do this, which is something I love to do.
That we enjoy doing.
Yeah, things that we enjoy doing. And we've been on a 3.5-year experience that taught us a lot, but also invaded our lives incredibly. And it was like PTSD getting out of that. Like, it took like a week for me to like not be pegged anxiety levels and just fucking. What am I supposed to be doing?
I know.
What did I do? Do I need to do something? Do I need to go get this freaking out?
I was just feeling this last night, in the middle of the night, like, can I? I want to just relax and let go, but I feel like I can't. Like, and my brain is like always trying to go into, like, what's going on? What do I need to do? Mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whew. Yeah. It was wild, but we're free. We're feeling good. We both have awesome things going on in our careers, and we have a 1-year-old grandson who fuck everything else. Who cares? Is the best thing ever.
Yeah.
And so since this is the time that we've kind of been freed up to be able to do this, I've had space to be able to, it takes a lot of like preparation to do one of these. And it just so happened to line up with Christmas. I thought, fuck it, let's do another Christmas episode. And this one, so if you go back and listen to there's 4 others. This is part 5, I guess you could say. There's 4 other Christmas episodes. The first one is just kind of like a general, like, how did we get Christmas? How did the traditions develop? You know, what was the path of evolution? Or at least ideas around the path. Nothing certain, right? So I don't, but it's very cool, a cool story. And you can just see how we made Christmas according to what we needed it to be in the times that we did those things, and kind of we now have our version. And so that's cool. The second one, we looked at a lot of like astrotheological stuff around Christmas and like why we even celebrate at that time of the year. What are some of the things that ancient cultures and societies and things, and how did that play into it? And so that one was interesting. And then the third one was Santa. Super fun one. I loved the Santa episode. That's a fascinating tale of just, again, us creating mythology in order to have it play a role in our lives according to our needs, you know? And one of those needs is making kids be good, because they're little shit sometimes. And so Santa helps with that. And just like that whole development of that character and all the different flavors and versions that have existed across areas and regions and cultures and things like that. And then last year we did part 4, which was angels. And we talked about angels and where that comes from and how this is this ubiquitous role that is played in various pantheons and religious and spiritual systems and things like that. And, how that also plays a role in our Christmas traditions and those going on. And so today I thought we're going to go to church. We're doing church. It's going to be a very different sermon from a very different perspective, but we're going to be telling Bible stories today. So if you were raised with the Bible, maybe you went to like Sunday school and you remember the flannel board and some old lady telling you all these stories. Well, I'm going to tell you some Bible stories. I'm going to tell them to you in a very different way than those old ladies told us those Bible stories. Or maybe you go to church now and you're like, oh, I know the Bible. I'm familiar with the Bible. Well, we'll see if you're familiar with the Bible. Because in reality, we are living in probably what is the most biblically illiterate time since
really?
Yeah, no, I truly believe
You
this.
think
There
that
are
when
more
people
people.
weren't reading. People couldn't even read back when then.
Yeah, but they did have leaders who, I'm not saying that they were telling them true things or real things, but they did have an understanding of the Bible from the clergy who did nothing but study the Bible and represent the Bible. In our culture, everybody's a Bible expert. Nobody knows what the fucking Bible says.
Yeah.
That is what I mean by illiterate. Not that they can't read.
I'm just saying the most of the time. I don't
know. I know you think that, but I'm just saying. Okay, let's just say this. Today is maybe the most dangerously biblical illiterate.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think because it feels dangerous because I'm in it.
Yeah,
but I guess I if I was in it when the Spanish Inquisition was going on, I'd feel like Bible misinformation was dangerous at that time, like the most dangerous.
Well, we also have to remove this idea that the Bible is true and real and people have just been off on it, right? The Bible is what we make it to be.
No, I know.
That is
but
a
I'm just
feature
saying,
of it.
I know, but I'm just saying. The Spanish Inquisition was a scarier time, and the Bible was the one leading that.
Okay, we could say that. I would say that there are elements of those intents and desires in our society today.
Okay, and so it's just not to say that this is a scary time.
It's a very scary time. And so I thought, let's look at Christmas from the standpoint of the Bible. We're going to be in the New Testament. We're going to be in the Old Testament. I just picked one particular thing, and I think what it will demonstrate and what I'm going to take us through is really indicative of what the whole Bible is. Mm-hmm. It is not God-breathed words that the Holy Spirit moved men throughout history to write, and it's been that is fucking childish and stupid. If you think all of the other ancient stories that sound just like the Bible are wrong and from the devil, and this one is right and from God, that is a really, really silly idea.
I think it's harsh the way you say that. People stupid.
That's silly. I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm saying that if you step back and you look at the Bible for what it is, it is childish to then somehow
it's very
slip
childish.
into. You have to do a lot of really imaginative
I'm not
leaps.
arguing. I really narrowed down to stupid. My word.
You're not stupid. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying anyone's stupid. What I'm saying is, if I just take the concept of, we have a bunch of mythology over here that we say is wrong, and we have a bunch of mythology here that looks just like it that we say is right, and not only right, but the ultimate right of the universe that I can then know the mind of God. Mm-hmm. That is fucking stupid. I'm not saying those people are stupid. I'm saying that concept that is that's just you just have to make so many.
But I'm just like your words were.
I know you always get on me about that, and I'm just being dramatic. I'm just like talking shit.
I'm just
I would never say this to your
knows.
face. I would never treat you in any way. But I'm just saying you're way away from me right now, people listening, and so I'm just gonna say shit. You can't beat me up. And so, but let's get into it because we're going to start in the actual Christmas narratives, the birth narratives of Jesus in the New Testament. And that's going to take us and launch us into an ability to go back into the Old Testament and look at some things. And my intent here in this sermon is to show you that the Bible, I actually believe the Bible is beautiful and important. Mm-hmm. It clearly is important. It has shaped our entire world in the West. Mm-hmm. Absolutely 100%. Mm-hmm. I'm an atheist living in a Christian-defined world. I'm not saying the world is Christian or that or anything like that, but much of the things that we have in our societies, especially in the West, come from what we would say is like kind of biblical philosophy, I guess you could say. Well, people reading the Bible and coming up with philosophy. That's what it is. Yes. The Bible does not hand us anything.
No.
We negotiate with the Bible. Yeah. We always have, and I want to show you that even the people writing the Bible were doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, and that this is not a infallible text. This is a incredibly important product that teaches us a great deal about ourselves, where we come from. We have a great view of like, how did we get these things in our culture?
Well, that sounds like what Joseph Campbell said, is every myth is true if you use it for what it was written for.
Exactly. Right? Like, it is mythology. Can we just agree with that? There's no talking donkeys in the world. No man got swallowed by a fucking fish. Mm-hmm. None of these things are possible. Not possible at all.
Yeah.
So we know that there's mythologizing in there. Are there historical events in there? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And people? Yeah. Is it incredibly important for our understanding of our ancient, especially going back to the ancient Near East, where civilization really began, and where all of this stuff, all the stuff that's in the Bible, it comes from much deeper, cultural transmissions and borrowing and adaptations and mm-hmm. things like that. We can learn a great deal about that through the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so what I've found, as I've kind of deep dived back into the Bible from mm-hmm. a very different perspective, mm-hmm. I remember, I love this thing. Yeah. I never loved it because of the guilt or the things that people were telling me it said, but it is this really fascinating.
Yeah.
It is kind of the core mythology of the Western world. Mm-hmm. That, again, we've taken into renegotiating, and it looks very different than mm-hmm. it did in years past or what have you.
Yeah.
But so it's important to know it and to understand it for what it is. And so just off the top, I'll just throw a couple sources out, because there is a lot of information out there. Biblical scholarship is an amazing world full of what I've found to be incredibly smart, caring, kind people. They do not hate God. Mm-hmm. They're not evil trying to disprove the Bible because they want to send you to hell. These are people, many of which started out as evangelicals and just like us went through a conversion through kind of learning.
But there are actually people who do want the truth, not just to be placated in their soul or inner mind with what they want to be confirmed, right? And so that's what I think ends up with biblical scholars or a lot of atheists weren't looking to leave their religion or trash their religion. Like we deeply believed it, but also we're just seeking the truer truth of it. Like that's what I was doing. I was wanting to know the truest truth about what I believed and dig to get away from all what I could see was a bunch of people layering on top of. This is what it felt like to me. Like I feel like people are just layering stuff on top of this truth, and if I could just dig down, I will get to the truth that was started, that originated, and that's mm-hmm. what I was doing, and ended up with that it wasn't true.
Yeah, and what I love about I totally hear that. Like, and what's interesting is that, and I was trying to do that too.
Yeah. And
what's interesting is that what you find out is, we were just doing the same thing as they were. Mm-hmm. We just had a different agenda, mm-hmm. a different need. Yeah. And so we negotiated with the text of the Bible according to that.
Yeah, yeah.
And it felt like a search for truth, but what it was a search to make this applicable and useful and relevant to what we had going on. Our wounds,
who we were,
our issues, our goals, our personalities, all this crazy mix of variables that determine how we negotiated with the text of the Bible, essentially. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally.
Yeah, and so these scholars, it's amazing. I mean, these are people who they, people are like, well, I know the Bible. No, you don't know the Bible. Yeah. Okay, and you don't love the Bible like these people love the Bible. It is their life. Mm-hmm. And they come from all kinds of backgrounds. Everything from people who are atheists. Are they doing it because of that? No, they would say, I'm an atheist because I don't believe in God. But I'm a historian, and I know ancient Akkadian, and I'm an Assyriologist who can translate cuneiform tablets, and I'm fascinated with this time period. And the Bible is absolutely the most important thing in my life. That they love it more, I think, than people who just, use it to hate gays or whatever they're using it for today, kind of thing. But as far as sources, I kind of consumed a lot of material. This was just something that came out of that, one little thing that came out of that today's episode. And so just to recommend, if anyone wants to go out and like learn more about what people have learned as we've been studying and continue to learn new things about the Bible, is so Dr. Joshua Bowen, he has a book out. It's in 2 volumes. It's called The Atheist Guide to the Old Testament, and it's volume 1 and 2. Awesome. If you want to know what the current state of scholarship is around much of things like the Exodus and child sacrifice, and was it right for God to say genocide the Canaanites? And most Christians will say, well, yeah, they were totally evil. Were they?
Yeah.
Do we have evidence of it?
Yeah.
And all of these things that we just accept as the biblical narrative and what really went down is confronted through archaeology, inscriptions, what we know about other cultures, all this kind of stuff, right? So that's The Atheist Guide to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2. Awesome books. Definitely check it out. I read Dr. Joel Baden. He is a professor of Old Testament studies at Yale Divinity School. He's a Jewish man. He's not a practicing Jew, but he's a Jewish man, so he has a deep connection to the Old Testament as far as cultural and things like that. And probably one of the preeminent scholars around things like the Pentateuch, and those are the first 5 books of the Bible, in case you've never heard that word before. What maybe you've heard called the Torah is the first 5 books, the books of the law, the laws of Moses. You'll hear, was it written by? Well, you should take a look at. He has but today I used his book, The Historical David, and also who wrote the Old Testament. Both those books are great as well. And then I also read, there's a guy named Dr. Bart D. Ehrman. He is probably the preeminent, mostly New Testament scholar in the world, certainly the United States. He's a Bible scholar and professor who has like 1.5 million followers on TikTok. Okay, so that's how preeminent. And then when you listen to him, you're not like, oh, I see why the kids are listening to this guy. He's hip. He's with it. No, he's a professor. He's kind of awkward sometimes a little bit, but he also understands the New Testament and early Christianity better than probably almost anyone in the world. And so I read his book, Jesus Before the Gospels, where he takes a look at kind of the earliest traditions around Jesus and things that maybe were used later in the development of the Gospels and things like that. So there's a whole bunch out there. I just wanted to throw that out so you know where I got my information from. I'm not making this up. I didn't like go to some Angel Fire blog or something and like read some crazy. These are like scholars. These are people who do nothing but study the Bible. So I'm going to.
I just want you to know that your mind is very sexy.
Oh boy.
It makes me warm in my tummy when I listen to you talk about what you know, even when I argue with you or sometimes get bored.
I love how you said, even when I argue with you.
What do you mean? I do.
I feel like when I say something to Marnie, her first thought is like, I don't know.
It's not everything.
No, but I mean, we have very different interests, Marnie and I, and so that makes for a really great relationship because we bring those really things to each other.
What you bring.
Yeah. I could tell you how your hair got the color it is if you would. And there's no reason for me to know that really. But anyway, let's get into this. It's kind of a long intro, but I just wanted to make it clear that as we head into the Bible, I'm not making this up. It's not coming from my feelings. Oh, Chris, you hate God or whatever. No, I mean, there is no God, so I can't hate God. Do I hate the God that's being presented to the world? Yeah, I kind of do. Right, that figment of our imagination. But with that, let's get going into taking a look at some Bible stories.
Let's do it.
So only 2 Gospels even mention Jesus' birth. What are they? Which 2?
Oh,
It'll be Quiz and Marnee.
I know. Mark.
Nope.
No, that's the ones that don't. Luke.
Yep.
And Matthew.
Matthew and Luke, right? Those are the only 2 out of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only Matthew and Luke have birth narratives, right? Mark was the first Gospel written. Scholars are pretty much all in agreement there, though much of the scholarship is riddled with Christian apologetics playing a role in their conclusions. And Mark has no birth story. It doesn't even mention it or refer anything about it, right? Mm-hmm. Mark opens up. He's in the John the Baptist is preaching in the wilderness. Jesus is like 30, right? There's no birth narrative at all. And Mark never even brings it up, right? The acid trip that is the Gospel of John said, fuck both Matthew and Luke. I'm going back to the beginning of time, man. When there was only like the Word, man, right? Like John is like, back in the beginning, man, there was like nothing but like the Word, right?
And the Word
was with God. The Word was God, right? If you've ever like tripped balls with someone out in the desert, that's John's gospel. It's all real cosmic. God is not, he does not seem to even care about the physical nature of Jesus so much. It's more cosmic and like very Gnostic and very like spiritual, right?
Yeah.
So Matthew and Luke are the only biblical sources we have for the birth of Jesus. Those are the only things in the Bible to talk about. And while I know your pastor told you these two accounts are of the same events, each with different details that you can harmonize perfectly into one divinely inspired.
It makes one beautiful story.
It makes one beautiful story. No, there's no problems in there. There's no contradictions, right? Trust me. Oh, don't read it, though. Just trust me. Listen to me, kind of thing. But these are really two totally different stories, likely written in as additions during periods of theological debate around the nature of Jesus, right? We'll talk a little bit about this. Like, there is serious scholarship and there's some consensus, especially around Luke, that these narratives around the birth of Jesus were likely added to these writings. And we'll discuss why they think that a little bit.
How do you think we missed? Because you you throw out there, they don't want you to read it to really know, but we did, and a lot of Christians do, really, really read it, really, really study it, and miss the issues.
Yeah, so that was actually something that was discussed in some of my reading and stuff like that, was that idea of...
Because people will be listening to us going, no, I study it, I fucking know.
Right. So... there's a lot of psychology involved here. Like, you can go listen to our episode about human rationality, and we talk about biases and cognitive strategies that we take. And it's just true that when it comes to things that are unfamiliar to us, we really scrutinize it. Our brain slows down.
Oh.
But when it's familiar...
yeah.
When it's something we've heard over and over and we've been told this is how it happened. This is what it means. Our brain just kind of makes it work. Our brain wants the story to work.
Yeah.
This is why things upset us in books when things don't tie together. And also why people will love a book when things don't tie together, because their brain just kind of made it, right? So that's the biggest component of understanding the Bible, is the fact that it is our brains understanding it, and it's doing all the things our brains are doing. And that thing was written for a totally different purpose at a totally different time that's lost to us, that doesn't even matter to us probably, but our brain brings it into whatever it needs to be. And so, yes, we're reading these stories, and we're going to talk about things that we just didn't pick up, but that's because we were raised on these stories. And we were told they made sense. And so we just made them make sense.
And they were part of a group that we were included in, that we needed.
Huge social reinforcement and needs. And you're not going to rock the boat. Who gives a fuck if the birth stories don't match, like in light of that kind of thing. I mean, you're not consciously thinking that, but like your brain is like just making it work too. All of those things, right? So, for example, when you compare Matthew to Mark... right, so when they take Mark, which they think is the first gospel, and they compare Matthew, when they take Mark and they take Matthew and they put it next to each other, Matthew has like 90% identical content to Mark. Oh. Okay. And so they know that Matthew likely had Mark as a source. This is why they believe Mark's gospel is first. I mean, many other things, but that's one of the things, is that it seems that Matthew was copying off Luke, or Mark, or using Mark as a source. And also Mark is very concise. There's not a ton of theology in there. Theology takes time to develop. So when they see this kind of like developed advanced theology showing up in the gospel writings, they know that was later on.
Yeah.
Right. Because the 12 fishermen weren't sitting around working out, all these concepts. That was much later. But when it comes to Mark, it's kind of like a sayings gospel. It's a lot of Jesus did this and he went and preached and he said this. And it just seems like a concise, short thing. Things tend to get elaborated and longer over time, not shorter and more concise. And so there's a lot of features of Mark that they believe that it was first. And Matthew, they believe completely had it as a source. Possibly Luke, but definitely Matthew, right? Luke's kind of a different animal when we get to that. However, Mark had nothing to say about the birth of Jesus. It opens with John the Baptist preaching and the beginning of Jesus' ministry, which means he's like 30 years old. There's no flashbacks, no Jesus wistfully remembering sliding out Mary onto a stone feeding trough. It's like it wasn't even a thing that mattered. And it's even possible that these traditions hadn't even developed yet when Mark was composed, right? Maybe that wasn't even a thing that developed around this vibe of this guy Jesus, Stories about his birth weren't yet being created and circulated and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So Matthew had very clear agenda in his writing. Tie Jesus to Old Testament prophecy. Now, I'm saying Old Testament. That's obviously a Christian nomenclature. Yeah. The Jews don't refer to it as the Old Testament. They call it the Bible. But but I'm using Old Testament because that's
did they call it the Bible before Christians did?
They do. Bible was not a Christian term. Oh. Bible is, we won't get into that, but it comes from the word essentially meaning book.
Yeah.
And they became the people of the book. We'll talk about this. This was before Christian. Yeah. So Matthew's intent was to tie Jesus to all these Old Testament prophecies, right? Every story he tells, the overall structure, and the details he shares are in service to this intent. He pretty much attaches, just like it says in blah, 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 whatever in the Old Testament, to everything Jesus does, right? Jesus did this. This was to fulfill the prophecy spoken in whatever, okay?
Matthew does that.
There's a lot of issues with those quotations. We can't find a lot of them in the Bible. Yeah, so it's not like, oh, wow, okay, so...
And we just read it going, I don't feel like looking that up. I'll just trust the Bible.
Totally. Or your pastor just said, what he's quoting there is Isaiah. And if you really went and looked, you'd be like, well, that's not what's being said here.
I think there's probably times that I did go back and look and it didn't make sense.
Yeah.
But you just go, okay.
They're the experts. Yeah. They're pastors. Their job is to know God and the Bible. I mean, that was my job, and people expected that in there. So it's like we just listen to authorities. And like you said, I'm not going to go read Isaiah. That's fucking crazy. So what does it mean? Well, he told me.
Well, I would have.
You would have. Right. But you would also then contemplate it's obviously.
Yeah, like if they pointed you to something that didn't make sense, I just would I just don't understand. They have studied it deeper or something.
That's what everybody does.
Yeah.
Right. So Luke may have had Mark and Matthew, or perhaps just Mark again, or maybe something else. We don't really know this. Mm-hmm. This is all based off of serious scholarship and clues and evidence. But the problem with the Bible is, when we're going to talk about the ancient world and some things around that. I mean, we have found a lot of stuff. I mean, stuff from 4,000 BCE, 3,000 BCE. I mean, millions of inscriptions, pieces of material, culture, writing, texts, a crazy amount of shit. Okay. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Bible, now again, your pastor will tell you there's so many copies of the Bible. It's the most copied thing in the world. Yeah, most of those copies came from the Middle Ages. Okay. And when we're talking about ancient biblical scriptures, what we have are scraps of paper, some of them no bigger than a postage stamp. Some of them have half a word on them. And so we do not have ancient copies of the Bible. Mm-hmm. We do not. Mm-hmm. The oldest, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the late 40s, I think 1947, up until that point, the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew scriptures dated to 1,000 of the Common Era, 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years old, talking about events that supposedly happened
1,000 years,
thousands of years before that. So we don't have this huge documentary attestation to the Bible. We don't have autographs. We have the originals of Assyrian inscriptions. We have the originals
like the full
of
thing,
Phoenician.
not just a piece.
Yeah, we know who wrote it, when, what was going on. The Bible,
none of that.
None of that.
So how do they, that's like a flat out lie then? How do they say we have the most?
Well, because if you just count the number of manuscripts, sure, there's a bunch of them. Like I said, most of them were copied well into the Middle Ages, when theology and doctrine and dogma and all these things already developed. So everything was negotiated in the Bible through the traditions of the church. And so that makes it very tricky because, and this is why the Bible means something different to everybody, right? When you read such and such inscription from such and such a king in Mesopotamia, you know, in 2200 BCE, he says exactly what there's stuff to figure out. And I'm not saying it's totally clear, but I'm just saying we get to the root of where it started. We know what the intent was because they're saying. In the Bible, we have to come at it and negotiate it fully, and we do that from what we need it to be.
Yeah,
is my point.
Okay.
So Luke may have had Mark possibly, and possibly Matthew. I don't know. There's again with biblical scholarship. There's a lot of theories around a lot of things, and those theories are not wild theories. They're not these. Some of them are contradictory theories, and they both have evidence. That's kind of the nature of the Bible. It is not something that we can truly. These scholars, they'll tell you, we are not seeking the truth. That is a human concept, a philosophical thing. There are people who do that. We're seeking to understand this in its historical context. We're to understand what they were saying according to the languages and what we know about it. And you know, they're looking at it from where does this get placed in human history?
Yeah.
Right? And what were the ramifications of that?
Yeah.
And what were the things? So it's a very scholarly pursuit.
Yeah.
They're not looking to find out what the Bible really says so the whole world will change. They don't believe that, and that's not their goal.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the Bible's a little tricky in that case. And so with Luke, we don't really know. Okay. They're certain that Luke, that whoever wrote, I keep saying Mark and Matthew, these people were not who wrote these things, right? These are pseudepigrapha. This was a very common thing.
Pseudepigrapha.
It means false writing or like false authorship. And essentially, it was a tactic used throughout the ancient world. This is not lying. A lot of this in our modern context, in our capitalistic world of copyrights and patents, we get real wrapped up in this. But the Bible stole shit from all over. But it's not stealing like we would think, right? And so it's, you know, it's whoever wrote these ascribed these names to it to give it authority or what have you. It wasn't to fool people or lie. Right.
Well, is it the same way that we use pseudonyms now for authors still use pseudonyms?
So that's like more of a nom de plume to hide our anonymity because we don't want people in our public lives or anything like that. This was more
to hide our
if you wrote a book and then said John F. Kennedy wrote this. Right, it would get like
it was for authority, not for
if
what
you
we
said
use
like,
it for privacy.
Right,
okay.
the life of a president according to John F. Kennedy. Now you'd be like, he's saying this.
But also, women use it for that.
True.
They don't say maybe a man's name, but they'll use J.K. Rowling.
Right, something that sounds more ambiguous.
That doesn't give away gender. They use initials for their name. So it gives it more authority because you can't tell if it's a woman because people will have things about a woman author than a male author. Right. So we still do use it.
Totally. And my point is like none of this was like in an attempt to like hide something. It was in an attempt to inject their agendas and their thinking into the church and the debate around the church for sure. There was intent and there was manipulation intended.
Yeah. But, especially using names of disciples or whatever.
Right, exactly.
To give them
exactly. It kind of gave them that credibility that would have elevated above other writings maybe that were circling around. That was like, who wrote this? This guy? I don't know. Fucking Luke. Oh, Matthew. Whoa. Okay. Now we're getting some, so that's kind of how it went. So Luke's intent is right up top. He's like, I sat down to put down a accurate, chain of events that took place, right? He's writing history is what Luke tells us. Mark we had to like infer his because his is always pointing back to the Old Testament. So he's trying to show that Jesus is the promised Messiah.
Were Luke and Mark supposed names of disciples? Or is that...
Mark
is, right?
is a name that he's not one of the apostles, but his name does appear in, I believe, one of Paul's letters. He refers to Mark, who seems to have, he's mentioned in kind of community, like he's like an assistant to Peter.
And they would teach also that Luke was a physician, like he was a doctor.
Yeah, that's just because, there's another mention of a guy named Luke. That's the problem too.
But was he a disciple?
No.
Okay, so
Matthew is not even that. So here's the problem. We don't know that these are the names. John is assumed to be written in the voice of John, the beloved.
Right.
It seems like that is true. It's hard to come to some other thing.
Yeah.
There are other theories around that this was a different John. And it's possible, and there's evidence, and it could be. But in general, the consensus is that John is supposedly the gospel of the beloved disciple, right? Mm-hmm. The John. Mm-hmm. Matthew, in tradition, is Levi, the tax collector member that Jesus picks up. Mark is kind of like a name that shows up as like an assistant to Peter. I think Paul brings him up in one of his letters. Mm-hmm. Paul's Christianity and then the Christianity of Peter and James and the apostles did not mix. They were preaching two very different things. They fought. They hated each other. They were in competition with each other.
If they even existed as
humans, right? So that's the thing is all I can tell you is
the ideas fought.
Right.
And the groups that behind them fought.
Right. And so it's the possibility of these being those characters that are being attributed to the authorship of these is there, but who knows? But that's what tradition that developed in like the 2nd and 3rd century began to kind of formulate around. So all of this is based off of people 100 years after Jesus making decisions and kind of thing. And probably writing things. Yeah. Okay. So now Luke does have the birth of Jesus in the opening chapters, right? However, there's rising support in biblical scholarship that the birth narratives in Luke were actually added later, possibly late into the 2nd century, and thus not an original part of the text. During this time period, there were several factions of Christians that had very disparate views of who Jesus actually was. So again, we kind of have this idea that, Jesus got these 12 guys together, and then everyone super loved him and all stuff, and he taught them all about being Christians, and then they just went on being Christians. That's not what happened at all, right? Mm-hmm. There was all kinds of ideas around Christianity before orthodoxy coalesced and they made everything else a heresy, right? Until power in one camp got to the point where they could crush all the others, there was tons and tons and tons of views. And one of the major views was on the nature of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Was he a guy? Was he a man? Or was he not? Was he a God, right?
Yeah. So, I remember learning about that concept that there was all these different ideas in the church history class that you taught at the church.
Yeah, and what would become the Orthodox view was not necessarily the most popular view in many kind of time periods.
I remember raising her hand and asking you when you were going through all this, like what was happening. She's like, "Where are the real Christians?
Where are all the Christians?
Where are the Christians?"
Remember what I said to her? This is them.
This is them.
They're right here.
This is what Christianity was. Mind blown. Open it. Yeah. She was like, "Where's the Calvary Chapel people that I have all the right answers?" Because I know this. Why don't they know this back
then? Didn't they have Jesus? Oh my God. So Docetism was a very large and influential form of early Christianity. Its name comes from the Greek word for illusion, phantom, or apparition, and it carries with it the idea of one thing seeming to be another when it really isn't, right? It kind of means to seem, something that seems to be something, right?
Okay.
So Docetism, the term that got applied to these particular Christians, come from that Greek word. This form of Christianity had various different flavors, but was centered on an argument over John's opening lines where it says, "And the word, logos," right, became flesh. What does that mean? Is that literal? Is it symbolic? What does it mean? And so there was a lot of arguments around that in the early formation of Christianity. In many deeply ingrained worldviews of the time, the spiritual and the physical were held as opposing forces, very dualistic. Only the spiritual was good. The physical nature, the flesh, it only corrupted. They weren't counterparts or things to balance. One was good, and the other one could only serve to degrade the good and the holy, right?
Yeah.
And so this was a very, very common philosophical bent. You see it all through Paul's writings, right? You're crucifying the flesh so that you can be a new creature in Jesus Christ. He's not talking physically, he's talking spiritually. He's talking in this very mysterious way, those things happening, right? Whoops.
Maybe. That's like PTSD. The whole like crucifying the flesh.
I know.
Ugh. Because that's what I fucking live.
That's what it was, right? We've died to the flesh to be reborn in Christ, right?
But like you can say that and people can hear that and be like, what? But having tried to practice it and live it out, such psychological trauma.
It's almost like it goes completely against the fact that we're physical human beings. We're just creatures on this planet.
Yeah,
and not magical things that can rid themselves of that.
It's such self-hate.
It's totally self-hate.
That you don't realize.
There is a deep anti-human thread that goes through a lot of these ideas at its core. Not that that's a conscious thought that people are having, but when you really consider it, it's saying you are completely evil.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, you do have conscious thought.
You do.
Absolutely believe that.
So if they were going to believe Jesus was a god, he couldn't also be a flesh and blood human. Those things don't mix. Different groups got around this using different tactics. Some believed Jesus' humanity was simply an illusion. People thought he was an actual flesh and blood person, but he wasn't, right? It was a trick. He just appeared. He took on the form of...
Oh, seemed like he was.
Yeah, like the people seeing him said, no, he was a dude. And they're like going, no, he wasn't a dude. He couldn't be a dude because if he was a god, he couldn't also be a dude. And so there must be something going on here. And so they chose to go with, he just made them feel like he was real, but he really wasn't a real flesh and blood. He was still just all spirit, essentially. Like a ghost. That's why they call the docetics, right? Illusion, a spirit, a phantom, not a spirit, a phantom, like that kind of thing.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck back. So it's traumatic to remember, and no wonder the fucking Bible is hard to read now because of what it takes me back to remember what it did to my mind. And what was I going to add to that? I don't remember. I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah. I mean, it's there is a lot of deep, hurtful messages that, under the guise of this is actually making me good and loving and things like that, but there is an insidious kind of threat. This is why I personally challenge other people's spiritual ideas, even outside.
Exactly. That's what
they're not Christian.
That's what I was going to say. Is that is why we have a lot of people in our lives that have spiritual ideas and beliefs about things, that this is why it's triggering to us for them to be talking in those ways, because from experience we know what it does subconsciously to people. Right. And they can say, no, I don't believe that, I don't think it's doing that. But holding those beliefs are that. They are hating your flesh.
Yes.
When you hold beliefs that are dualistic, that spirit is good and flesh is bad, or you say, they don't even say flesh is bad. They're a little bit more. But spirit is better.
Right.
Just holding that belief higher, better in some way above flesh. That's shit.
Yeah. And
it does shit to your mind, and I fucking hate it.
Yeah, and it sucks because I do come off sometimes as kind of like telling them that they're dumb or whatever. That isn't what I'm ever motivated by. It's more, I'm like, I like you. And this thing is telling you that there's something wrong with you. Yeah, it might not be in line with Judeo-Christian values. It might be a totally different, more exotic, more universal sounding language. But it comes from the same roots, which is the best way to get return customers is to make sure that you're always pointing out the thing that can't be fixed, and that is who they are. And so they come at you telling you, well, you can be better, you can be higher, you can be more evolved.
Fixed.
Right.
Pointing
and you just have to take my $5,000
workshop. We cannot
workshop.
undo our flesh. We can't get rid of. We can't be unhuman.
It's
we
a grift.
Cannot.
Right.
And pointing out and then exploiting. And telling us that what we are is not okay.
Right. That's what I hate.
Yeah.
And I think all spirituality out there has a level of that.
Yes.
Because that's the only way it's going to keep going. Because it doesn't work, it's going to run out. You got to keep them coming back for more. And so, this is just a part of being human. Is this experience that we have and the brains that we have we don't understand everything about how we process information, and so we fill in the blanks through all this magical stuff, and that provides hooks for people to come along and take control, essentially. And so, anyway, let's get back to this. Okay. So, let's see. Different groups. Oh, whoops, already did that. Others suppose that the Spirit entered him. So when he got baptized, and there's a whole thing in the Bible when he gets baptized, what descends from heaven on him? Onto Jesus?
A dove?
Yeah, it says a spirit as if like a dove.
As if like a dove.
It might be just language meaning, it just dropped like a dove floats down, or it might have looked like a dove. In all the artwork, obviously, it's a dove.
Because it
the fucking church that I was a part of and was ordained in, that was their symbol, was the dove, a symbol of the Spirit of God descending on Jesus. Anyway, some docetists believe, well, he was a real guy, but he wasn't born a god. And then during his baptism, the Spirit descended on him. Then he was able to do all this God shit, miracles and walk on water and calm the storms and all this bullshit. But then it departed him on the cross before he died. And that way, to them, that creates this separation. Like, the Spirit of God wasn't corrupted by being born into original sin or dying because all flesh is corrupt and will die, kind of things. And so, there was different flavors, different ideas about how Jesus was God, and and what was his nature and things like that. But all of these things were kind of being battled out. Like today, there's Christianities that have kind of inherited some of these ideas. Jehovah's Witnesses I believe, if I'm correct, that the Spirit departed Jesus before he died on the cross for that very reason, right? And so these things were very definitive, and they were very definitive, meaning they were seeking to define and describe these very core concepts. And one of those very first core concepts was, who the fuck was Jesus, right? What was he? And there's all kinds of fights that went on. It's highly probable that the nativity count in Luke was an addition made during these times to provide legitimacy for what would become the Orthodox view. Docetism was completely rejected by the Council of Nicaea by 325 AD and would later be deemed a heresy in the later formalized Roman Catholic Church. And so, while these were all raging in these things, eventually power accumulated enough into the Roman kind of Orthodox development, and they eventually took power and were able to deem what was and wasn't an acceptable or even, kind of correct view of Jesus. And they just basically began to call these people heretics. There would be lots of flavors of this that continued on into the Middle Ages. There was many, many groups like the Lombards and others that were burned at the stake by the church. I mean, this was like, this is something that continued on, but it was something there also at the very, very beginning. Makes sense, like these discussions. So who knows? We don't know, if Luke's was a later addition because of these discussions. Well, I mean, here's what I'll say about that. Just to give you a little view into like why people would say that. There are some differences we'll talk about in a little bit, but Actually, you know what? Let me hold off because I think there's a better launching point to tell this thing. Okay. But I'll explain to you why there is really good evidence that this is possibly a later addition, right?
Okay.
But who knows? We'll talk about it in a second. Most of what people know, though, of the Christmas story, of the birth of Jesus, as they drag out their nativity scenes and advent calendars every December, is actually extra-biblical tradition, much of it contained in writings that were popular and circulated amongst Christians in the early days. What we have in the New Testament today is likely a tiny fraction of the stuff that was written in early Christianity that was lost, fell out of popularity, was replaced by something new, or were even banned as different doctrinal camps gained power and influence, right? Mm-hmm. For instance, Mary riding on a donkey, not in the Bible, not once, not whatsoever, right? Animals at the manger, not in the Bible. There were no animals at the manger. There's no sheep and cow and all that fucking shit. Right? All of that is tradition that comes from other sources. In fact, that comes from the Proto-Evangelion of James, also known as the Gospel of James, which is a mid-second century text that is part of a genre called infancy gospels. So while this was going on, there was like these doctrinal debates around Jesus and his nature. There was lots of writing popping up within the church, seeking to get their agenda across, what they thought the right answer was. And there were a lot of things called infancy gospels, which, you know, just served to fill in the blank of like, what was Jesus like as a little boy, you know, that kind of thing.
So these people, okay, back then, their writings, they're all over, right? They're all happening. Did these people, as they're writing these stories, believe Jesus actually existed, or did they?
Yes, I believe. I mean, I can't answer that question for sure.
Individually, but like as a consensus, these writings were people that thought it actually existed. So
that's a great question.
Then were they, like, how did they even feel like they had the authority to write what happened if they weren't there? Well, if they thought it was a real person, but if they thought it was like a story to get across a message, then they could hone their story to make sure the message was gotten across a certain way. That makes sense to me, but to believe that they actually thought Jesus was a person, but then different people are saying different things about him when they didn't even know and they weren't there.
Yeah, so did they think they were writing scripture? No.
No.
Absolutely not.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Is
no,
that
I know.
No.
But listen.
Okay.
Did they believe? One, we have to, it's so hard to approach this because we live in a world where there's an incredible amount of information, and yet still we are seeking the magical and the miraculous and the amazing. They lived in a world where there was, it wasn't like they're simpletons, right? That wasn't, there was many people, even Aristotle and Plato wrote against how silly it is to believe in these gods, kind of stuff, And so, I or maybe Socrates, I don't remember if it was Aristotle, but whatever. I may be around there. But, I mean, this is, not something new. It's not like the whole world just believed all this stuff. But, I mean, we see that in our world today. You look at, a political party, right? They have a set of beliefs that we would look at and say, that's fucking stupid and crazy. But they write tons and tons of material,
but you're
some
talking
of that
about
becomes
ideas. They're writing today about ideas. They're not making up a person. They're not making up a person.
Are they? Is that true?
Like a person that doesn't exist.
Are they? I mean, I think that they do. Also,
they make up a person that doesn't exist.
Well,
and name
what
them.
do you mean by exist? Would you say
a human being named Jesus?
Uh-huh.
They made up a person that doesn't exist and then wrote about his life.
Well, we don't know that Jesus didn't exist. There is evidence for both. There is good arguments on both sides of that debate, and I probably find myself somewhere in the middle where I can see the points they're making. Now, did the Jesus of the Bible exist? No.
Right.
Does the Donald Trump of the Republican Party exist? No.
Okay.
He does not.
Okay.
They wrote a bunch of shit and said a bunch of shit and got on Fox News or whatever and did a bunch of shit in order to frame him within a context that serves their agenda and their purposes and needs. Okay? So we need to look at it from this very human perspective. They were in a world where there was vying for power in this new group.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out who fit where do I fit into this thing? Carrying with them all these beliefs that came from this Hellenized world that they lived in gave them plenty of stuff. Mm-hmm. So did Jesus exist as the New Testament tells us he existed? No. Fuck no. There's no. Was there a guy that maybe just later on got purpose? Well, we're going to talk about that here in the Old Testament too in a second. Okay. So yeah, Jesus probably was that, you know? Okay. So it's hard to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so we need to put it into like, what do we do? Well, we do the same fucking things.
Yeah.
Just different contexts. It might not be religious. I mean, it gets to religious levels when you get to Donald Trump, depending on who you're reading.
Yeah.
So it's like, my point is, we're doing this still. They were doing it, and they were doing it long before, because humans do human shit the whole time. Mm-hmm. We've been humans. So like, that's just how it goes, right? So anyway, the stuff that we believe about Christmas, largely, when we drag out, you know, when we set up our nativity scene, you know, that shit is not in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, that all comes from other stuff that people...
Which is so funny, because when Maddie posted about or messaged in our family thread about people complaining that the Christmas lights up at Manitou Park, and they didn't have the nativity set there, so now it's just a holiday thing and not an actual Christmas expression.
And die.
I know. I know.
Fucking
that
shit.
Like, there's not even the nativity scene is not even in the Bible, so you're stupid.
Yeah, it's crazy.
No, see, there I go calling people stupid. Sorry.
Yeah, see how easy it is. Anyway, so like I said, that the ideas of these animals and a lot of these traditions, they come from these infancy gospels. One of a very popular one was a mid-2nd century one called the Gospel of James. It's supposedly written by James, the brother of Jesus, right? So that lends it this huge credibility. The fact that James was long dead. If there was a guy named James that was a brother of a guy named Jesus, means he obviously didn't write this, right? So again, that just goes back to a way that they wrote. And so in the Gospel of James, the author goes into pretty detailed stuff about Mary's pregnancy and delivery, right? It's like he's saying like, no. Jesus was born just like you and me. Blood, fluids, screaming.
Which book?
This is the Gospel of James.
The one that's in the Bible?
No. That's the Epistle of James, again, not written by a guy named James. But this is an extra biblical. This is an extra biblical source written, you know, maybe like 100 to 150 years after the supposed life of Jesus and these events. Okay. And so he goes into like really mundane, dirty details to make it so you go like, oh, I can't imagine that this light just kind of came out of Mary's stomach and Jesus was born as this godly. He was a human being born just like you and me. Right? You can see they got an agenda.
That's what his agenda was, yeah.
It even talks about how the midwife, who they named Salome, you know, it shows up all over the Bible. Who knows what the fuck? They're just pulling names. Slid her fingers into Mary and went like, oh, her hymen's still intact. Oh, geez, she's still a virgin. Ugh. And it even goes on to explain how, well, actually, James and, you know, all the brothers of Jesus come from a previous Mary of Joseph. And so they're really Jesus' stepbrothers.
A previous marriage?
Before Mary. Right? Because the idea is we got to like, Mary's got to be a perpetual virgin. Jesus got to be a person. How do we work this out?
That's according to the Catholic doctrine.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though, is that, and this is where we get all our Christmas traditions, is from the things that these were being written to prop up. Okay. And so they're like, well, her cherry's not popped and she has stepkids, so she's a virgin forever. You know, that kind of like that tradition kind of took hold in the church. And Protestants would go like, well, we don't believe that. All of your traditions come from that. They all have that imbued in it. We'll talk about Mary in a little bit and how terrible, really, when you read the Bible from a perspective of what it really is, you start to really sympathize with characters in there and the way that we've treated them, sometimes even maligned people.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. Mary's story is kind of dark, actually, I think. We'll talk about. The point is, the version of the story people know is not the story in the Bible. It's a wildly implausible folktale that has evolved over time, been syncretized with other legends and myths, and shaped by forces such as capitalism and social changes. That's how we got our Christmas traditions. It's not in the Bible. Yeah. Okay. Now, so quick question. Where was Jesus born?
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, right? That both the accounts say this. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is he ever called Jesus of Bethlehem?
No.
Ever.
No.
Through the Gospels. In fact, Matthew and Luke never bring up Bethlehem ever again after the birth narratives.
Yeah.
They don't refer to it.
No.
They don't hearken back to it. Paul doesn't bring it up.
Yeah.
In fact, really, it just really doesn't even factor in. John does, though, and I want to look at it because it's interesting in light of this idea that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, okay? And so, some quick context here. They're actually, this is out of the Gospel of John, and the Feast of Sukkot is going on in Jerusalem. Sukkot, also, if you have a Bible translated to English, obviously, it's rendered like the Feast of Tabernacles. Have you heard of that? Or the Feast of Booths. It just depends, you know, whether you're doing King James or NIV or whatever bullshit translation you have. And it was kind of like Jewish Burning Man. It was literally that. It was to commemorate their wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus and how they lived in tents for 40 years. And so it was...
But was there art cars?
You know what? There was all of that shit. You laugh.
Yeah.
It was a festival, music, dancing, food. People would bring things to share. There were ceremonies. There were parades. This was Burning Man. Okay? And so what's going on, though, is Jesus and his brothers are up in Galilee. Excuse me. And they're packing. They're getting ready to go. We have friends that go to Burning Man. It's a huge ordeal. So they're getting all their shit together. They got to pack their tents. They got to bring 4 species of plant with them because that's a major part of this whole thing. You had to have a myrtle branch. You had to have a citron fruit. You had to have a, cypress branch, I believe. And then you had to have something, a willow branch. I think. You had to have all these things, right? And it was all part of this stuff in the law. And they would tie these 4 species of plant together and they would wave them at each other as people walked through Burning Man and did all their thing, right? And so they're getting all packed, but Jesus says, hey guys, I'm not feeling the burn this year. I'm not going. He does. And they're like, oh, what? You know, like, what's not going to be the same, but we're still going because we want to go. He's like, go. That's fine. I'll stay here. And then you find out, oh no, he's totally fucking with them. And so he kind of disguises himself. I don't know how, but he somehow slips into Burning Man. He goes down after them, slips in, kind of sneaks in. And so while they're there, there's all kinds of different things going on, like required kind of events. And one of those events is the priests would take a thing of water and pour it out on the altar. Right? And again, this is all tying into like they're wandering in the wilderness. If you remember from the wilderness, they didn't have any water, and Moses hit the rock, and water came out.
Yeah.
Remember all that shit?
Yeah.
So all this is just symbolic of these traditions, right? By the way, scholars absolutely are sure the Exodus didn't happen. There's no evidence for this. But in their historical memory of their culture and their religion and their people, this is how they celebrated this thing from their past, right? That they believed. So Jesus goes down there. Well, just as apparently this priest is getting ready to do his big thing, where he's going to pour water out, and it's this big thing and the celebration, Jesus hops up on stage, grabs the water, pours that out on the altar, and he says, if anyone is thirsty, come to me, and I will give you living waters, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's fucking saying I'm God. So he shows up to their like God Burning Man and claims to be God. And that throws everyone into a fucking uproar. People are like, arrest this motherfucker.
Yeah.
And then people start arguing in the crowd over who this guy is. Some of them say, well, this guy's the Messiah. I mean, who else would do that? It's crazy, but people do this. So do that now, right?
Yeah.
If someone gets Mary burnt into a piece of toast, people will pay a bunch of money to come get healed. Like, we'll do crazy shit just off of whatever.
Yeah.
Some people said, like, well, I mean, he's got to be, this guy's clearly a prophet or something, right?
Yeah.
But then other people said, well, wait a minute, though. This guy's from fucking Nazareth. The prophecies say the Messiah is coming, it will be born in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Nobody says, whoa, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. His brothers don't say, oh, well, our parents actually were from Bethlehem, or were in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. No, nobody says shit.
Yeah.
It's like They're just saying, how could he be Messiah? He wasn't born in Bethlehem. That's all it says about it.
Yeah,
it doesn't correct it.
Yeah.
The writer of the gospel, he was writing it. He could have fucking put anything he wanted in there. Mm-hmm. And they didn't. And so, again, there doesn't seem to be anywhere else in the New Testament this idea of a birth in Bethlehem. It seems to be later added in order to deal with questions and issues that are arising as they're formulating this new religion. Seems to be what's going on, okay?
Like,
does that make sense?
Yeah, this guy rose up, but he's from Nazareth, and they need to tie him to Bethlehem because the old books said the Messiah was going to be from Bethlehem, so they need to like make him more credible and like find a way to tie him to Bethlehem.
Exactly, right? And by the way, the story goes on that the priest gets so pissed off that they have cops. They have a police force. And so they call the cops, and they're like, go arrest this motherfucker. He just ruined Burning Man. I don't know if you were there, but he totally fucked it up. And so the cops go, and they come back without Jesus. And the priests are like, what the fuck? And they're like, dude, man, have you heard that guy talk? Like
What were the priest cops called?
I have no idea. I don't remember.
What do you call them? What do they say in the story? Why are you calling them?
Oh, it just says the police. It's rendered essentially that. It's a word that essentially means like their enforcement of their religious
biblical laws. Okay.
Now, at this time, they did not have power
to
fucking do all the shit.
Right.
So this is a story.
Right.
Okay. People want to act like there's stories of like Jesus like keeping people from stoning a woman, for instance, or whatever, right? The woman caught in adultery.
Right.
If those guys would have stoned that woman, they all would have fucking hung on a cross, probably.
Uh-huh. They're not allowed to do. They're not allowed to do that.
It would be like it's like militias, United States, taking it upon themselves to get arrested real quick, and end up on really serious charges.
Yeah.
Same thing, right? So this is a story. This isn't facts, right? This is like this is what they're telling, and there's a reason they're telling the story, right? And it doesn't have anything to do with the truth of God. It has to do with their agenda and what they're trying to say and accomplish, kind of thing, right? So anyway, where's Jesus actually in the stories? The rest of the stories?
Where is he?
Where's he from?
Oh, Nazareth.
Nazareth, right? Jesus of Nazareth. We've heard that a million times, right?
Yep.
And so now, in Matthew, we're going to get to the gospel. Let's get to the birth accounts here. Because in Matthew, Mary and Joseph are already in Bethlehem. There is no trip. There is no need for a donkey. Not that it's in there, but you don't even need a donkey because they're already in Bethlehem. It opens with them apparently living in Bethlehem. This is where they live. And the events basically go like this. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. By the way, it's the smallest little mention, right? It's crazy because you can see like what's going on here because it's during the Annunciation. That's when the angel is telling Mary that she's gonna get impregnated by God. And no, I'm sorry. In Matthew's, it's Joseph that's being told this. And then it says, and they were in Bethlehem. Jesus had Mary. And Joseph never fucked her until she had Mary. Mary had Jesus. And by the way, Joseph didn't fuck Mary before Jesus was born. That's all it says. That's the birth narrative. If you want to just talk about the birth, right? And so Jesus is born in Bethlehem. The Magi come visit, right? The three wise men, whatever in tradition, but the Magi. Then they have a dream that they need to escape the Israel. Well, it wasn't called Israel, Palestine at the time under Roman kind of vassalage, and so they escape to Egypt. Right? Remember that part of the story? They escaped to Egypt, 500 miles away. By the way, they didn't have a fucking plane ride or a train or a car or a wagon. they walked apparently with a newborn 500 miles to Egypt. You can see like Egypt plays a major role in the Exodus and all this stuff in the Old Testament. You can see the symbolism that they're doing here, right? So then Herod, meanwhile, murders all the baby boys under 2 years old in Bethlehem and the surrounding region. Holy shit. Yeah. If you think about that, this loving God needed to bring his son into the world, and it cost thousands of dead babies? Yeah. That's dark shit, and I don't understand how we got through that without questioning that seriously, right? Not only is there absolutely zero evidence, please can you imagine the writing that we have so much writing from this time period in this region? Mm-hmm. Nothing. There's no evidence for this. Yeah. This is all just made up legend, right? Mm-hmm. And so Herod murders all the baby boys, and then they get told another dream while they're in Egypt. We don't know what was going on over there. That's what a lot of the infancy gospels fill in. Like, what was happening in Egypt? Well, Jesus was doing magic tricks and teasing other little kids and playing mean tricks with his magic powers. And like, that's all that extra biblical shit happened. Mm-hmm. But he gets told, hey, you can go back to Palestine. And on the way, they get warned again in a dream that don't return to Bethlehem because people are still looking for your little boy because he's so important. And so then in Matthew 2:23 it says this, so they head to Galilee, and it says, there he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Okay, so in Matthew's story, they're in Bethlehem, living in Bethlehem. Yeah. Have the kid. All this shit goes down, so they have to leave. They go to Egypt. They're going to come back. They're going to go home to Bethlehem. Mm-hmm. But God says, no, it's too dangerous there. And so they head to Galilee, and they made their home in a land called Nazareth. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. You got the story?
Yes.
Okay. That's how it goes, right? And by the way, this quote from Matthew, he will be called a Nazarene, is not something in our current text of the Old Testament or the Septuagint or the Vulgate. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures that happened in like the 2nd century BCE. The Vulgate is the Latin translation that happened in like the 2nd century, I believe. Mm-hmm. AD or early 3rd century, I don't remember. But that was by a guy named Jerome, an early church father. Mm-hmm. And so this passage, he will be called a Nazarene, doesn't show up anywhere. Okay? So it could be from some other text that just didn't survive, didn't find its way in. Who knows? Hear me out. It could be just made up, which it probably was. Mm-hmm. Some people think, well, Nazarene, I mean, that doesn't really show up in the Old Testament, but Nazarite does. Do you remember that word?
Yep.
Do you remember the difference between the two?
Yeah, it's not a Nazarite is a vow.
Okay,
it is not
look at you.
This is not awesome. A place. It's a practice. It's a spiritual practice to undergo.
Give me an example of a biblical character who took a Nazarite vow.
Samson.
Oh, Marnee. Okay, so see, you guys are in Sunday school today. Yeah, Samson, the guy with the long hair. That was part of the Nazarite vow. Yeah. Couldn't cut your hair.
Yeah.
Remember in the story, like when Delilah you know, convinces him. The story is crazy. It's so nuts. But she cuts his hair and he loses his strength. And then his hair grows back and whatever. So a Nazarite vow. John the Baptist is believed to have taken a Nazarite vow. Yeah. It tended to be from birth. Yeah. But not always. Yeah. It was usually something the mother committed their kid to. Like, if I have a son, I'm going to commit him as a Nazarite. Yeah. And they became these kind of weirdo traveling preachers. You know, like John the Baptist is described as wearing fucking camel fur and like eating locusts and honey. Right? Like this kind of wild character. So maybe they're talking about Jesus in that light. But, I mean, those are all guesses and theories. There's no real way to know. What likely went on is that there's discrepancies in these traditions, and they're trying to harmonize them. They're trying to make them work.
I remember as a Christian knowing that they call them Nazareth, and then you go, oh, is that the same as Nazarene or Nazarite? And then learning, oh, Nazarite is not actually a place. Nazarene is a place, but Nazarite is not, and it's a practice. And it, to me, like you said, we talk about like our brain makes patterns and likes. So my brain liked the idea. It was poetic.
Yeah.
To tie together Nazareth and the Nazarite vow as like a physical place that was like Jesus is physical, but then the spiritual concept of a Nazarite vow because he is high. It just made sense to me to put those together, and like, of course, God would do that in this story.
And then again, your pastor would say, like, this is what God was doing across thousands of years. We'd be like, oh, wow.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Those words have nothing to do with each other. They come from totally different roots. It's not the same thing. But
it's like kind of like the things that to biblical scholars look like, oh, this is evidence that this is not true. in this way, those actual things made me as a believer were like, well, yeah, God put this story together.
Yeah, exactly. This is why when you go to church, they try and keep you from sending your kids to secular colleges because all this blows up, right?
Yeah.
So you might be thinking, wait a minute, that isn't the story. Where's the dick innkeeper who turns away a pregnant lady? Where's the manger? What about the shepherds and angels and all that shit, right? Like, notice Matthew's story had none of that. No shepherds. Mm-hmm. There's no room at the inn. No, he had born in a stable or a cave or all these other traditions that have come up. None of that happens in Matthew's story, right? So for all that stuff, we need to turn to Luke's account. It's a very different animal right off the jump. So remember, Matthew tying to Old Testament prophecies. He tells this tale. He winds up in Nazareth, and he says the reason why he ended up in Nazareth is because the prophecy says he'll be called a Nazarene. Mm-hmm. No prophecy of that, but whatever. That's his point. You can see his intent there, right? In Luke's story, Mary and Joseph live up in Nazareth, up north in Galilee when it opens. They're in Nazareth, living there. That's their hometown.
Yeah.
Okay. Already a problem, right? These things can't be the same story. These are two different stories is what I'm going to tell you, right?
Right. They don't harmonize.
Not at all. There's no, I mean, well, he came down, went back up. What the fuck are you doing with a 9-month pregnant woman?
He traveled there.
100 miles on foot. Fuck you. They weren't doing that. There's symbolism and this is a created myth. So how did Joseph and Mary and ready to give birth Mary wind up in Bethlehem, which is almost like 100 miles away? How did they get there? Do you remember in Luke's story why did they go to Bethlehem?
For taxes, for census.
For a census, right? Census. So here, I'll read it. Luke 2:1-5 says this. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Holy shit. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. So remember, Luke sat down and right off the bat says, hey, I'm putting down an accurate event of what happened. Here's what happened. They're up in Nazareth, but then Caesar Augustus decided to count the whole world. This didn't happen. There would be evidence of this all. I mean, this is Rome, okay? This is a backwater fucking country bumfuck place down here in the Holy Land, what we call the Holy Land. It was not some major center of like Rome. We would know all about this. This didn't happen.
Yeah.
But he gives some markers, like Quirinius was governor. Yeah. So it allows scholars to go like, okay, what is happening here? Let's look at this, right?
Yeah.
So first off, the Romans kept insanely detailed records. So we know historically that Quirinius was appointed as governor over the region in the year 2 CE, right? The year 2 of the Common Era. We know that. Mm-hmm. Why? Because Rome fucking kept right. We know.
So Quirinius was governor after supposed Jesus even existed.
Okay, point 1. Good. You're tracking. So actually, in 2 CE, that is actually when this area actually became a province of Rome. It was not an official province of Rome up until Quirinius was appointed as kind of the governor, because it was under the vassal leadership of the Herods. Remember, King Herod was king of the Jews, and Rome let him manage that area. However, he reported to Rome, and Rome was always there. Right? Okay. So when they appointed Quirinius, that was after Herod's 2 sons had fucked it up so much that they said, fine, we're taking this place over. And then it became a province. And that even poses an issue we'll talk about when it comes to the census, right? So what about the timeline? Did the Bible nail the timeline? It provides a lot of historical markers that we can use to like people, events, things like that we can look at this. So the problem is, the story has this happening while Herod the Great was king, but he died in 4 BCE, okay? So like 6 years before Quirinius was even appointed as...
Who died?
Herod.
Oh.
And so Luke has Herod the Great ruling and all this shit.
Uh-huh.
And Quirinius
governing at the same time.
Exactly.
But Herod was dead.
But Herod died
before
years before Quirinius was even appointed. We also know that Quirinius, in fact, did issue a census in the region because it was a new province. And so the first thing Rome was going to do is going to like get a count so they can start taxing them like a province.
Yeah.
And we know that Quirinius did issue a census, but it didn't happen until 6 CE. That's 10 years. That's a decade after Herod died.
Yeah.
And so if it happened while Herod was alive, no later than 4 BCE, it also can't have taken place during any census happening by Quirinius a decade later. It appears that whoever wrote Luke took known historical events and characters and rewrote them back into a particular time in order to use them to build the story according to their intent.
And
we would call this like historical fiction, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we have stories like this.
We have tons of them.
Okay. So they're, because I love historical fiction. My favorite.
Me too. And if you approach this as historical fiction.
Now, I know I read historical fiction trying to grasp an idea of what was happening, but knowing that there's like filler in there.
Yeah, it's kind of like what if scenarios, right? Or you know what I mean? Like it's like, yeah, and it
gives
allows
me
the author. It allows the author to build a tale using these different components. Yes, they didn't exist in history at the same time, but they all bring something to the story.
And some of my books actually explain that, so that you're not like thinking that this was like in the prologue or the whatever little
of course
appendages that they add. They go like, these were blah blah blah, were put together this way, but it may not be blah blah. Right. They kind of explain that.
Yeah, exactly. They explain the symbolic nature of it and the creative license they're taking to tell the story.
So that helps, because if I'm like sitting here listening, going like, why these people are just like making shit up? It feels deceptive, but it like just writing historical fiction. They're not trying to be deceptive. They're trying to give you a feeling for that time or something that they felt that happened and what was going on, and give it in an ingestible way.
Here's what they're trying to tell you is, what did it mean? And what they're writing from is the perspective of what it meant to them.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The Bible's the same fucking thing.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying, is we need to approach the Bible that way.
It's historical fiction.
And it's so hard because we've been ingrained with this idea that it's different, that it's special, that it's sacred, right? Yeah. And if it's just writing like any other writing, well, then it has a very different kind of takeaway than what we currently get out of it. And so, speaking of the census, on a technical level, we know a great deal about how vassal regions were taxed under Rome. And we also know about their census activities thanks to all those records, right? They didn't do any of this. They taxed people according to land ownership primarily. Having people leave the land they own to go to some ancestral home is totally antithetical to this operation.
Right.
That's crazy. Why would you do that, right? And if Caesar Augustus had issued an order to count everyone in the world, there would be evidence of it, and there just simply is not. On a more common sense level, what the fuck kind of system is this? Everyone has to go back to the birthplace of their ancestors? How far back? We'll learn in a minute that Joseph is 42 generations removed from David. He had many other ancestors living in all kinds of other places. What if you aren't descended from David, but you were born in Bethlehem? Do you have to go to your dad's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa's hometown? Like, how does this even work?
Which ancestor? Exactly. Okay, yeah.
This wouldn't give an accurate account of shit. How many people's ancestors are from a particular town? Who cares?
Yeah.
Not to mention how this would shut down the entire economy.
Yeah.
As everyone closed shop, left their homes, and traveled hundreds of miles to some ancestral homeland this is a crazy thing that could not have happened. But it does serve as a very good literary device to get Joseph in fucking Bethlehem. Okay, Joseph and Mary and Jesus, obviously, to Bethlehem, right? That's all it is. It is not true. It did not happen, but it gets him to Bethlehem, which is what you do when you're writing a story. You know, like you gotta have reasons why things are happening.
Could have just done it like the other guy and just been like, well, he lived there.
Well, but I mean, yeah, but there are different traditions. There's different traditions floating around. There's different ideas that people have. And
which one was written first?
Well, we don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
They probably didn't. Here's the thing. Did they not know each other were right? Like, they didn't know about... Because you'd think that you would see that you were contradicting, and then when the Council of Nicaea put them both in there, they were like different.
All of this was just human intrigue and political, power structuring and things like that. Did they know each other? We have no idea. There's no originals. There's no idea. There's no even original thing that tells us about the writing of these things. Right. All of this comes hundreds of years later. So this is all being written in to fill huge blanks. And it's all being written to carve a tradition that has an agenda behind it that usually has to do with power.
It's just crazy to me that even in the Council of Nicaea that determined which books were canon and which books were allowed in, that they put two books close together talking about the same thing that contradicted each other. Well, that would seem to be so fucking obvious.
Yeah, I know, but that's just, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. That's what happened kind of situation, right? But let's keep going. Okay. So this didn't happen, and the story kind of sucks when you read it and you really consider it. But it serves as a literary device to get Joseph and Mary to the place the writer of Luke needed them to be when Jesus was born, Bethlehem, right? So he's up. So in Matthew, he's in Bethlehem, flees to Egypt, comes back, can't go to Bethlehem, goes up and moves to Nazareth. In Luke's, they live in Nazareth. There's a census, makes them go to Bethlehem so that Jesus can be born in Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem is the center, is the reason for this. The fact that it doesn't come up in Luke's gospel again shows that this was just a one-off thing to get Jesus this certain box checked next to his name, right? Yeah. We can imagine someone who knew the tradition of Jesus being from Nazareth, but not about him being born in Bethlehem. As they compare these two gospel writings, they need to somehow be harmonized together. It would appear somewhere along the way, the situation they fixed the situation essentially by covering all the bases, right? They just kind of happened. How did it happen? No one really knows. There's no path or trail you can follow to get you back. This is one of the problems with especially New Testament biblical scholarship is there's just a lot of stuff we don't know. All we have is stuff that popped up later. And so they have to then untangle what happened in that intermediate time that influenced this. And can we get back to something that was kind of like a core of the original Jesus kind of movement and what it became? I don't know. That's kind of what they're doing, right? So anyway, these aren't the same stories, and they certainly are not eyewitness accounts as your pastor will try to tell you this Christmas Eve at church, okay? They're not. Matthew and Luke both have another same but totally different feature in their stories.
Oh, they're probably telling them right this minute because it's church time.
I know.
Sunday before Christmas.
Right. So they have another
11:40 church. Just dismissing, and they've just been told.
That's right. So both of the accounts also have something in there that are common, and they're a genealogy of Jesus, right? Of Joseph, actually, it seems. But they both have them, but they're both different. Right?
Yeah.
Which is weird when you consider what the word genealogy means. Having two family trees is an issue, right? One of those is a problem.
Not right.
Or both of them, maybe. But
right.
But so in Luke's genealogy, hold on. So they're both different, and it seems weird, but the way that apologists try and fix this, and way that I was taught by pastors growing up in the church, was that in Luke's, it's tracing Jesus's family line through Joseph, his earthly father or whatever, not really, stepdad or whatever.
Yeah.
And then in Matthew's, it's Mary's, right? That's what I was always told. If you have a study Bible, that's what's going to be in the notes next to it, right? And they're going to give you all these reasons why that is the case. And all those reasons are a bunch of apologetic nonsense. That's just basically trying to make it work. In Luke's genealogy, he takes you all the way back to Adam and even God as Jesus's ultimate ancestor. And there's also a weird thing about Luke's genealogy is that Matthew opens up with the genealogy of Jesus, right? It's like so-and-so begat so-and-so, and then so-and-so, and father of so-and-so, and father, and it finally gets down to Joseph, the father of Jesus, right? In Luke's, the birth happens, all this shit goes down. I don't think I finished Luke's story too. By the way, after Jesus was born in Luke's story, There is no flight to Egypt.
Yeah.
There is no anything.
Yeah.
They go to the temple. They do the things you're supposed to do when you have a baby, right? There's like a list of things you had to do. We might go get our babies christened. They went to the temple and had all these things done. Had to be circumcised, all that stuff. And so when that was done, it says, so they went home to Nazareth. No Egypt. No 500-mile journey one way. And then a 500-mile journey back. So it's like these are two totally different tales, right? And so, but the weird thing about Luke's genealogy is like he tells the birth story of Jesus, and he includes all the shepherds and all that shit, right? And then it kind of talks about John the Baptist out there, and then Jesus gets baptized, and then Jesus' genealogy shows up. That's kind of fucking weird. You would think it would be right up front. We're talking about the birth of someone.
Yeah.
And yet Luke's is structured in a way that the first two chapters are the birth narrative, and then chapter 3 opens up with him being baptized. Now, there are copies, versions of the Gospel of Luke. Okay, do you remember when Jesus is being baptized? We already talked about this, and the Spirit comes down like a dove. Okay. What did God say? Remember a voice from heaven?
This is my Son, who I am well pleased.
Damn, you are good. That is what Matthew records in his gospel. Mark also. This is my Son, in you I'm well pleased.
Okay, yeah.
There are copies of the book of Luke where it says, "This, you are my Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Today I have begotten you."
Yes.
Okay. That's different than he was born the Son of God.
Right.
And so
that's where they get
scholars believe it is possible that Luke originally, the beginning of Luke was what we call chapter 3 now, where he gets baptized. God then says, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. Today I've begotten you." And immediately after he says that, the genealogy of Jesus is told, and it goes all the way back to God.
Oh.
Matthew's just goes back to human ancestors.
Right.
To David. We'll talk about that in a second.
Right.
Luke's goes all the way back to Adam, who was the son of God, made by God. Yeah. And so, like, it makes more sense that possibly Luke's did not include a birth narrative whatsoever. And that there was no even idea of him being born a God in this miraculous way. He was a preacher. He gets, all this magical stuff happens. And then he becomes the Son of God at 30 years old as he begins his ministry. Yeah. And then it launches into, and here's his genealogy that goes all the way back to God, who just said it was a son. Yeah. Makes more sense, right?
Yeah.
Then story, he grows up, he's 30 years old, he gets baptized. Oh, let's talk about his genealogy. That's fucking weird, right? And so there's what I'm saying is there's good theories and evidence behind possibly Luke not even containing this, right? So, but let me read. I'm not going to read the genealogies, right? That's fucking crazy. But I want to talk about Matthew's because remember, Luke's is supposed to be Joseph's and Matthew's is supposed to be fucking Mary's. But let me read the last line of the genealogy in Matthew's account. That's supposed to be Mary's. It says, "And Eliud, the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar, the father of Matthew." This is what a genealogy is in the Bible. It's really rough. "And Matthew, the father of Jacob, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus, who is called Messiah." And you ask a biblical, like a Christian apologist, and they'll say, "Well, in their culture, the woman, blah, blah, blah." That is not what the fucking text says.
So the Christians will try to say that they actually meant that Jacob was Mary's father, but they wouldn't list it that way because of their culture, a misogynistic culture, that didn't give women any identity of themselves.
Right. That's exactly what they would say.
Yeah. And so it was Mary's father, but they just said Joseph.
Right, because Mary
of misogyny.
had no status, and so they always...
Because of misogyny, let's just say it.
Yeah, exactly. and by the way, there's no evidence that this is just us imagining what it was like back then. And making it work in our minds. But this is not the genealogy of Mary, okay? Mary is just like attached to Joseph, right? This is his kind of genealogy. So even that it just doesn't work. And the two genealogies are different. Like I said, Joseph has a different dad. Not a different great
Well, that's how they would explain that it's actually Mary's dad.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is it's not. And that's how they get around that.
Let me tell you a story of misogyny.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, So what does this have to do with Bethlehem? Well, let's look a little further down in Matthew's version, and it will become clear. So he gives his list, again, totally different than Luke's, and he ends it with this. So all the generations, this is Matthew 1:17. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportations to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations.
How convenient. So
God
convenient.
just like knows how to structure things.
Perfect.
You know what I mean? He's like, go out in the woods. How long? 40 days. What do you mean? Always. I told you that's the standard, right? So it's like these numbers obviously.
14 is what do you call it? Connected to 7. How do I say that?
A multiple of 7.
Thank you. I'm like, what's the fucking math term? A multiple of 7, which is perfection.
Okay, well, we'll get into more of what this is. Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, 14 is a multiple of 7, but let's keep going because I think something else may be going on here.
Okay.
It's not that isn't a possibility. It certainly is, and that's certainly something
no.
to see.
It just is always tied.
Yeah,
it's just always in there. Even if it's a side thing, whatever. Go on.
Yeah, and so there's actually a cool literary tool possibly being used here. It was a genre it was something that was super common, especially in Hebrew literature. It was called it's called Hebrew gematria, which, people today, if you get on TikTok or some shit, they'll break down all these words. This is a system of where they would assign a numerical value to each of the Hebrew letters in their alphabet, and then that would then allow them to get the sum of words and things like that.
Yeah.
It's not secret. It's not magic. It's something that would have been understood by the readers who they were writing to. It was a way to encode meaning, symbolism, highlight things.
Yeah.
And so in this case, 14, 14, 14, 3 times. That was also very significant in ancient cultures, not just Jewish cultures, but like Hebrew cultures, but like ancient cultures. Repeating things 3 times carried with it significance, weight.
Emphasis. It emphasized whatever was being said or expressed.
Exactly. So that if that is what's happening here, the problem then becomes what group of letters that equal 14 in Hebrew is the author referring to, right? So like people are going, okay, 14, 14, 14. We know that they use gematria a lot. This seems to indicate that that's what's happening here. But then it comes down to like, well, fuck, I mean, there's no clues, right? Like other than 14. And so let's start. Well, there's really no way to know. But one suggestion that has some traction is that when you take the Hebrew letters Dalet, Vav, Dalet, if we alliterated that into English, it'd be like DWD. Okay? There's no vowels in, this Hebrew writing and stuff like that. So DWD would equal 14. 4 plus 6 plus 4. Okay? And what does DWD spell in Hebrew? David. Right? And so is it definitely this? No, we don't know that's true. In context and according to literary kind of tools that they used, is this entirely possible? It is, right? Remember, he's just talking about the whole point of Matthew's genealogy was to tie him to David.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of them getting to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Because it's the house of David. It's the Bethlehem means house of bread, right? And it was the hometown of David, as we'll see. And so it became known as the city of David. And so if you're going to tie Jesus to David, he's got to be somehow tied to fucking Bethlehem.
Yeah. It's interesting that it makes it 2 things like these types of things make it feel very magical, miraculous, makes the writing feel miraculous. But also, like if I think about someone writing like this today, which they do,
absolutely,
it seems like genius. I'm inspired and in awe of someone who can weave a tale with so many intricacies in it that you could just read forever and just like find
these people
things.
were
It's
too
fucking genius.
These people were
and it's incredible. Today, I don't think this is a magical text. I don't think that. I think, God, that fucking person is a genius. the way they put that together.
Oh, I mean, you should see some of the things that have been found and the complexity and the thought.
No, but I'm just
geniuses that did
this. What I'm saying, like, we have people that do this today in story, and we think that they're just genius. That's how I feel about them. And but then when I think I'm listening to this and going, oh, this is what I remember. When I was Christian, because it's my brain's doing it now. Like, though I'm not believing it, it's just like my brain's going, oh yeah, back when I was Christian, this just multiplied the strength of what felt magical to me. Yeah. That the texts were doing, all this was interwoven.
Right.
And it solidified to me that God did this.
Right. It was pre-programmed in our brain that this was different.
That this was different in God.
What I'm suggesting is, and I'm like tearing these stories apart and saying they're dumb or whatever. These were geniuses who did this. Okay, we could not do this.
Yeah.
And all of the ancient writing. I mean, these were minds that were as
and I think because and we think that they weren't as smart as us back then. We think it had to have been God because they weren't as smart as we have become.
The only people who think that are people who have not looked into this, because
history,
that is not the that is not the view of any serious scholar of any ancient society.
Yeah.
Their cities, their civilizations defined what we call a city and what we call civilization. These were geniuses who created something out of fucking nothing.
Yeah.
And we are the direct inheritors of it. Yeah. So we need to understand these are not people that are dumb or sinister or anything like that.
Yeah.
However, it also is no different than any other ancient writing. It's a story, and we need to understand it from that standpoint and approach it that way.
Or even current writing that we do. I'm bringing it to relevance today. Like, we still write like this, and it's incredible when how your mind can put so many different aspects to just make something feel really real. So you can go deeper into the story and like be immersed by it in every angle, and just like. It's a great fucking story.
Yeah, yeah. So David, right? And more importantly, Jesus' connection to David is a huge deal in both of the stories, right? Luke outright says it. He says in Luke 1:32, the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. That's as the angel is telling Mary that.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's turn our attention to this character, David. The birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke, they kind of wind up making sure that we understand Bethlehem and David is a very big deal to the Messiah. The Messiah has to come from David, right? What does he have to do with Christmas? Well, if you are like us, nothing, right? Just like Jesus has nothing to do with Christmas anymore. But if you're a believing type, your whole concept of Christmas hinges on David. If Jesus wasn't a descendant of David, he couldn't be the Messiah. The Bible itself is telling us this. Or if the David referred to by Matthew and Luke, say, never existed, that would probably raise some issues on whether Jesus is a magical space god man promised by God thousands of years ago too, right? So if Jesus is the reality of who Jesus was, hey, if Jesus did all that stuff and he didn't descend from David, or that David that they're talking about didn't exist, well, man, who fucking cares what he did? You know, like that disqualifies him, essentially, right? If we're going to take the Bible seriously, that's what it says, right? So, everybody open up your Bibles, right? It's time for church. We're going to look at the life of David. Maybe you grew up hearing about David. You probably didn't hear the whole tale of David. Maybe you grew up... not in the church at all. You have no idea other than, well, I know the Star of David. I've heard of that. I'm gonna like tell you the story of David.
I heard all about David.
Yeah,
one of my favorite stories from the time I was in third grade. I implicitly remember.
And I guarantee you.
Implicitly, that's
you're gonna hear it differently this time, right? So when it comes to where we find David in the Old Testament, his story shows up in a few different places, a few different books. Now, in our modern Bibles, they're broken up into two parts, these books. So it's Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. In your Bible, it'll be 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and Kings, 1st and Chronicles, right? Samuel is likely the earliest of the Davidic accounts, and possibly it was even written during his reign or shortly after, and some scholars are perfectly fine accepting that someone named Samuel even wrote them, right? And the reason they believe that, and this would put it, we'll get to that in a second, but it would put it being written sometime in the early 10th century, and it covers a time frame of about roughly 1105 BCE to around 971 BCE, which is when David's reign supposedly, according to the Bible, ended, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not like they said in the year 971. They gave other clues, and according to our calendar and the way that we've done, we've worked out when this would be on the way we reckon history, right? But they would have been in the 5th year of such and, you know what I mean? They we have to use other clues to get there. So that's Samuel. Samuel's probably the earliest. We're going to mainly be there. But then he also shows up in 1st and 2nd Kings. So this is set in a period from the end of David's reign, again, about 970 BCE, to the exile in Babylon, which is in 586 BCE. Okay?
Did those things really happen, both of those? The reign of David and the exodus to Babylon?
Definitely the exile to Babylon happened. We have Babylonian inscriptions that tell us exactly what happened.
Okay.
Right? And not the Bible, other things that prop up the Bible.
Okay.
Absolutely happened.
Yeah.
In 586 BCE.
Okay.
Which means that then Kings was being written 400 years after the time of David.
Okay.
According to them.
Okay.
What the Bible says, right? And what they're, whatever.
But King David, you said Babylon for sure. I also asked, did King David actually exist?
Yeah, we'll get there about all of that stuff.
Oh yeah, we're getting, this is that story.
Right.
Okay. Jumping ahead.
And then in Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it starts with Adam. It goes all the way fucking back, right? And then it goes all the way through to the end of the Babylonian exile. So that would have been about 538 BCE. So again, we're almost 500 years past the time of David when that would be written. And it spends most of its time on that kind of Davidic monarchy period, right? So it covers a very large swath of time, but it spends a lot of time on the David years kind of things. But again, being written almost 500 years later. Okay. Imagine writing something about the 1500s right now. Without going in the whatever. You just write, give me a history, right? So that's what they were doing. They were doing that kind of stuff. So the obvious first question is, before we look at a story, was David a real person? Okay. So the answer to that question is definitely no, maybe yes, right? And what does that mean? Well, the character as presented in these biblical accounts did not exist. He is clearly legendary at the very least, and potentially a fully mythological founding figure like many cultures in the ancient world had. In fact, Rome is named Rome because they have a myth about their founder, Romulus, who was this very blessed by the gods. He was part god. He did all these miracles. He died. He rose from the dead and became a god. And so Rome, they believed their founder was this mythological Romulus. David could potentially be one of those figures, too.
Does Rome believe that he was a myth, or they believe he was real? Or is that just same as all religions? Some people do, some people don't.
Yeah,
okay.
I don't know.
And I feel sad to hear that David may not have been
real.
let's
get to it. I'm not saying that he didn't exist. I'm saying that
in
the Bible, the story of David.
It's okay if he didn't. It's fine. It's just funny noticing in myself a little sadness that this character did not exist.
You know what other character didn't exist? George Washington in the history books that we read growing up. That was all tradition and legend. That was all. We do this with everything, okay?
Like George Washington existed, but not the George Washington that we read about.
Yeah, the history we were told, the highly mythologized. And
that totally makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But, okay.
So for a long time, the myth theory around David, that he was just a myth, was pretty much the consensus. If David lived and ruled and the text of the Bible was accurate, they would have found his name all over the inscriptions, writing, and archaeological evidence that has been gathered. They have deciphered ancient languages, found literally millions of pieces of physical evidence and inscriptions from these cultures and time periods. David was not to be found, not even mentioned, not once at all.
Huh. Dang it.
Now remember, he supposedly united Israel into this powerful united kingdom and did all these amazing things. Well, we have all this writing about people that are even mentioned in the accounts in other lands, Moabites and fucking
yeah.
And nothing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For a long time. However, in 1993, a stele is a stone monument that was erected by kings and leaders that would tell of some great battle victory or great thing or building projects or kind of a time period. But we found many of these things, and they provide a huge amount of information about that particular time period, world, people, all that kind of stuff, right? And so one of these was found in 1993, and it was uncovered at a site known as Tel Dan. So Tel means mound, and so Tel Dan is the mound of the ancient Israelite city of Dan. Dan is all the way up, right on the border of Syria and Lebanon, okay? Way up in the northern part of Israel. And so over time, these ancient sites, as they decayed, they would get buried by dirt and erosion and all that stuff, and they turn into mounds. And so in archaeology, they refer to them as tells.
Okay.
They know there's shit there, and then they start digging down, and they do all this stuff to figure out the dating, all that archaeological shit. So this inscription is found, right? The inscription has been dated to between 870 and 750 BCE, and it's written in Old Aramaic. That is the language of the ancient Canaanite Aramaeans that showed up in the Bible quite a bit. You can see how much this sucked by the fact that Jesus supposedly was speaking Aramaic. Well, they spoke Aramaic during the time that Jesus supposedly lived. And so thousands of years, that language held, man. And so it's written in a language that they know.
Yeah.
And so they uncovered this thing.
Yeah.
It tells the victory of a ruler who is bragging about his defeat of two kings. They are referred to as Jehoram, king of Israel, the son of Ahab, all in the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay? These are real people being mentioned here. And Ahaziah, king of the house of David. That is the first fucking time that David is mentioned in any evidence anywhere, right? Now, this would have been written 100+ years after David's rule ended, according to the timeline of the Bible. Okay, so we still got some time, but this was a huge fucking deal.
Yeah.
And if you think Bible scholars are like, damn, maybe the Bible's right, okay? That isn't how they operate.
Yeah.
They will all tell you, dude, if we could fucking dig up the original fucking copies of shit, we would be so excited. That is what they want. So this was a huge deal to them. Everyone was pumped about that a description of David, a mention of David is found, right? The words are Bet David, which most scholars believe should be read House of David. Like how Bethlehem means house of bread. Beth means, Beth El means house of God. El is the word for God. Beth, house of God, right? Yeah. There are some who have other potential readings, and they aren't crazy. This stuff is complicated and nuanced. But for the most part, scholarship around the ancient Near East sees this as the first, oldest, and only mention of David in any archaeological discovery or textual evidence ever. Again, this is one mention amongst millions of things that have been found and analyzed or translated, right? So, yes, we found this. Everyone's like, there you go, the Bible's true. And you're like, well, hold on a second.
Yeah.
All we can say is this definitely shows that David was in reference to kings in the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay? That's all that we really know from this so far, right? The story on the stone inscription talks about a victorious king whose name is likely at the beginning, but this piece broke off long ago and has never been found. This king beat and personally killed both of these two Israelite leaders, right? He mentions Joram and Ahaziah, and he says, I beat them and I fucking killed them both personally. He says, he probably didn't, but that's what rulers do, right? I killed Osama bin Laden. Well, you were sitting in the Oval Office and some SEAL Team 6 guy did. Too. But, I know what you mean. That's kind of what's going on here. So based on the events that unfold, many believe that this was likely from King Hazael of Aram Damascus, who was an important and highly attested to historical figure who ruled in the region in the late 9th century BCE. He even shows up in the Bible with interactions between him and Jehoram and Ahaziah, the two kings on there. Yeah. But he doesn't kill them in the story. In fact, Ahaziah pays him off with stuff from the temple, and he goes back to Aram. So in the Bible, yes, he shows up in the context of these two kings. But in Ahaziah, who's the the king of the house of David in Judah, right? The story goes, well, he's fucking shit up. I mean, Hazael, the king of Aram comes, he's fucking shit up. He's outside of Jerusalem now, and it's funny too because it's so relevant. Like Hazael is the king, and he's been king for like 20 years, and in the beginning of his reign, he said, "Okay, priests, because they need to rebuild and do some repairs on the temple, right? Gather money, tithes from the people. We'll all fund this. We're gonna fucking GoFundMe this thing, right?"
Yeah.
And so they've been collecting for 20 years, and Ahaziah starts going, the temple doesn't look any different. Okay. This is like the tax-free dollars that supposedly are going to heal the blind and sick and stuff like that churches get.
Yeah.
And yet doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah.
That's what Ahaziah is like.
Yeah.
Fuck, what?
What's going on?
So then next thing you know, Hazael shows up and he's panicking like he's already destroyed towns. He's going to kill me, kill everybody. So what he does is he tells the fucking priest, give me all that shit. All the shit you collected, all that money. And he gives it all to Hazael. And Hazael goes, okay, that's fine. I'm going to go back home. That's how the story goes in the Bible between these guys.
It's funny. Well, they talk about history is told by the winner, but both of them claim to be winners. So.
Sure. Well, but hold on. Maybe it's not about them. This is only because they're supposing this is Hazael because of some things. One, it's in Aramaic, and he was the king of Aram at this time. Okay. And two, it mentions these other two kings.
Okay.
And those two kings show up. They're not concerned with do these match. They're concerned with like, what is he referring to? What can we find out about this when we compare the Bible and this, right?
Okay.
These interpretations are also tricky because it isn't like this is some perfectly readable thing. Okay. This is thousands of years old. There are parts missing, characters that are difficult to decipher, and other things that make it very difficult to recreate it.
Yeah.
We have a lot of high-tech tools, a lot of knowledge. I mean, couple hundred years now of understanding these ancient languages and developing our understanding around it and things like that. And still, it's difficult, right? This isn't just like pulling out a sheet of paper and reading it. It's fucking carved in stone thousands of years ago, and it's been buried and all this shit, right? So, for example, one section mentions Hadad, which was the name of the storm and rain god of the region of Aram. Okay. Another name for the Mesopotamian and Canaanite god Baal. We see him in the Bible all the time, right? Baal is even referred to as Hadad in some ancient mythical literature. And so Baal, and Hadad, sometimes they're fused together, sometimes they're different, but I mean, it's kind of the same concept, right? The natural inclination of the scholars, looking at this inscription was to consider this as evidence for Aramaean authorship. Aramaean language, up north, which is right by where the border would be with Aram, it mentions Hadad, which was an Aramaean god. This must have been written by an Aramaean king, right? And that's why how they got to, it must be Hazael. His name's not on it, but when we look at the clues in the Bible and the time frame and shit, that's what we come to.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like an educated guess is what they're after, which is what all of this shit likely, for the most part, is. However, in recent analysis, another translation has been put forward that may make better sense and fit with a totally different person who battled it out with these same two kings in the Bible. Okay, there's another person that's tied to these two kings, and we'll see. Maybe it fits better. One that the new version would have it read, "As for Hadad, I struck him," which seems to indicate this is a person, not a god. Okay, so this was super common. You're like, well, why would some dude have a god's name? Everyone did.
Yeah.
Everyone did.
Yeah.
Elijah. That's El and Yah. That's the God twice. In fact, it's like, I think it means Jehovah is God.
Yeah.
Right? Anyone with L on the name or Jah. My name is fucking Christopher. Okay? I have a theophoric name. That's what that's called, right? Our grandson Ellis does too. Ellis comes directly from Elias, which is just Elijah, right? It's just a Greek version. And so these are theophoric names. It was very common to be named after gods, right? Tons and tons of people were. And so Hadad, they think, oh, maybe it's a person, it's a human, right, and not a god. It's not referring to Hadad as in Baal. It's referring to Hadad as in a dude who had that name, right? It just so happens there is a warrior king in the Bible who was tied to Jehoram, Ahaziah, and a guy named Ben-Hadad, right, which means son of Hadad, right? Just like naming your kid Son of God,
Jackson,
whatever that would be.
Jackson,
Jackson,
like
exactly. But this would obviously
Harrison.
say he's blessed. Rulers would obviously have these because they had to legitimize their rule through God's sponsorship and shit. And so his name, the warrior in the Bible that encounters these three characters, his name is Jehu. Okay, one thing when you read the Old Testament now, all the heroes turn out to be fucking the villains, okay? Yeah. Jehu was an usurper rolling around Israel trying to seize the throne. There were a king in the north. There was a king in the south. Of course, the Bible frames it all. Oh, well, they were bad kings, and Jehu was so righteous and good because he liked my God and thought like me, kind of thing. And so Jehu is this major figure who is like literally ranging around Israel, killing people, destroying people, and trying to take over the country, okay? In the biblical narrative, Jehu beat Ben-Hadad, who was the son of the king of Israel, and thus he definitely did strike Hadad, right? That's what the inscription in this new possible reading, when it says, as for Hadad, I struck him, he killed him. So he probably did, right? In 2 Kings 9, we read the account of how King Jehoram was injured in a battle and it was recouping in Jezreel. King Ahaziah from the southern kingdom of Judah, these are the two guys on the stone, okay? So Jehoram gets hurt in battle and he goes to kind of recoup and get treated for his wounds in the city of Jezreel. Ahaziah from the south hears about this, and he comes to visit the king, probably to make plans and figure out what they're doing because they're getting fucking thrashed by this Jehu guy who's like, kind of like a coup plotter, right? He's like an insurrectionist. And so as they're there, though, they see a chariot coming towards the city. And the Bible literally says this. One of the guards says, it's definitely Jehu, I can tell. He's driving like a maniac. That is what the Bible says. So Jehu apparently was fucking he was just a crazy driver that people could even see, oh man, that's him. I know. That's who drives a chariot like that. Whatever. Maybe. So they send messengers out and to go like, hey, Jehu, you're just coming for peace, right? And they send messengers out. And every time the messenger reaches them, now remember, they don't have cell phones or walkie-talkies, whatever. They just send them out. They end up falling behind Jehu and riding behind him, and he's still coming towards the city. They send out another fucking messenger. He goes out there, hey, are you coming for peace? And Jehu says some fucking bullshit, and then they fall in behind him, and they're going towards the fucking thing. And so Ahaziah and fucking Jehoram are like, not good. And so they decide to bail. And so they get on their chariots, and they take off, right? And they wind up meeting kind of each other, the three of them. They take off basically to meet him, and they end up meeting in this place called Naboth's Vineyard. Naboth's Vineyard is super symbolic, okay? Because of events that happened just previously around Jezebel, the most maligned woman in all of history. But some shit went down there with Jezebel. It would be like me saying, and then Hillary Clinton faced off with the host of Fox and Friends on the streets of Benghazi, right? that wouldn't happen. But you understand the symbolism, right? And so they end up meeting at this very symbolic place that's tied to other, to show just how poetic justice this is or whatever. And essentially, they're going back and forth. Jehu calls fucking, which was Jehoram's mother, a whore. That's Jezebel. Totally calls his mom a whore right there to his face. And then some other shit goes down, and essentially the story evolves to where Jehoram goes, oh shit, Ahaziah is conspired with Jehu, right? Whatever happens, he figures out, shit, Ahaziah is basically giving me up.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So Joram wheels his fucking chariot around and goes to take off. And so he's speeding away. And it says Jehu pulled his bow as far back as it would go, it says. And he let her rip, and the arrow goes right through his back, into his heart, out the front, and he fucking dies right there. And Jehu tells his men to dump him on the land, which is the vineyard of Naboth. Again, this poetic kind of scene, right? And Ahaziah isn't killed now, but he is killed later by Jehu in another kind of thing, right? And so here we have a guy who faced off with these two guys, and he did kill them. In addition, he also beat a guy named Hadad, which also seems to show up on this inscription. And so there's a lot of kind of consistency building around possibly this is what's is going down here, right? And so this could mean this stele was quite possibly created and installed by an Israelite, not an Aramean, right? Not a Canaanite, not a foreigner, right, to them, but an Israelite. Namely Jehu, who usurped the throne by violence, beating other competing Israelite factions and royal families, who put it up as propaganda in the north. He had it written in Aramaic because that is what they spoke up there.
Yeah.
So he's got to he's got to unite this. They don't all like these people, right? We make it seem like, and God spoke to Israel and said, "This will be my king." And everyone went like, "Oh, that's God's king," you know? No, they're warring, right? This is like human political intrigue.
Yeah.
And then them writing stories to explain why this went down the way it did, right?
Yeah.
So, does this prove David was real? Not necessarily. In fact, if it is from an Israelite like Jehu and not an Aramean, it may be even less strong of a piece of evidence, as it would be less likely for a foreign author to refer to a mythical Israelite than it would be an Israelite author to do so, right?
Right.
Kind of like how only Americans are prone to mythologizing our founding fathers. Like I said, when they are taught in other countries, they don't get the same legendary treatment that they get here, right? They're seen as human beings who did human things, good and bad, right? But we don't treat them like that.
Yeah.
They're inspired to this and that, right?
Yeah.
So does this mean David was an actual person? Not necessarily.
Right.
There is only one piece of evidence even to support that idea, and it is this one. Okay?
Yeah.
We can't say, well, when you compare it to the other David mentions, there
no
are none.
Other.
Right.
So there's one mention, and it is suspect.
It is suspect because it doesn't talk about King David. It just says so-and-so from the house of David.
Right.
Well, if they're roaming around calling themselves the house of David, well, then these foreign kings would begin calling them that too.
Yeah.
Not because they thought that they were traced back to David, but because that's what they called themselves.
Yeah.
So it gets a little bit tricky there as far as like, is this really? But it is possible, right? So was David real? There is at least some possibility he was real and historical and living in the first millennium BCE. Most scholars believe, if this is true, he was likely more of a local tribal warlord than this glorious king who united the North and South under a powerful monarchy. There is no archaeological evidence for this whatsoever. So if he did exist, it was much different than who he became to in later Israelite memory and religion and myths, right? Kind of like King Arthur. Some people think there was a guy who led a small group of people in post-Roman Britain, but nobody thinks the stories are what actually happened, right? And many believe he was all myth and legend.
Yeah.
There is evidence for all of those with David too. He is like that, okay? And we need to look at it like that.
Yeah.
So point one is that when Christians needed to tie Jesus to David, it was the David of the Bible. And the David of the Bible did not exist.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no way he did.
Yeah.
You can do the math on that one if you want to, right? As far as your belief in Jesus.
So they're like trying to make this God-man real by tying him to a myth.
Right. Or is it possible that it's a myth being tied to a myth?
Yeah,
that's also.
Like,
We'll talk about some of this. So, and as we will see now, the David of the Bible is actually a very complicated character that different peoples at different times for different reasons rewrote according to their political and social agendas. Mm-hmm. We need to think of him more as like a Robin Hood or like I mentioned King Arthur character. Mm-hmm. How many movies of Robin Hood have you watched? They don't tell the same story. It's all like, I'm going to write Robin Hood as this guy. I'm going to write Robin Hood as this guy. I'm going to write him as this guy. That's kind of what seems to be going on in the Bible around David, right? So, and there's a lot of room for interpretation and creative license, and the writers of the Bible use it extensively. Mm-hmm. David is a great way to understand this, because this is like what we're going to talk about David here in the Bible and what we can tell from the stories. It is what's all over the Bible in different ways and different whatever. The Bible as a whole was composed in this way largely, and David kind of gives us a little microcosm of how we can see what's going on, right? And what they were... Maybe what they were intending when they wrote, rather than what we imagine in 2024 they were intending to tell us how to be good people living in whatever. So, in the first several centuries of the Common Era, right? This is like after the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple is gone, right? This is like now the Jews have become that none of their access to God is available to them anymore, the way that it has been, right? And so this started kind of the rabbinical Talmudic tradition of rabbinic Judaism, right? They became the people of the book, because they no longer had a temple, right? And God lived in the temple; He couldn't live anywhere else. They don't have God carried in their hearts like Christians talk about, right? It's the book is how their relationship with God happens. And so they begin writing and stuff. And so they discussed how, when, and for how long David, like what time did David get up to study the Torah? How many times a day did David pray? David prays never in the Bible. There's like maybe one time where you could say he was praying, but it's not really prayer. All the Psalms of David and all that, that's all bullshit. That's all tradition. That no one believes any of those. No real scholar believes those Psalms were written by David. There's no evidence of him being this prayerful. There was probably no Talmud either.
No,
I mean, Torah.
Yeah, I remember, because again, studied extensively and loved the character David and the book of Psalms. And I remember having the question, like, when was David writing these? Because he was really busy doing ungodly things a lot of the time. That
Ooh, we're going to talk about those.
And like, did he write them? Oh, I think it was like the most likely time if he had written them would have been when he was actually the more innocent shepherd boy before he was king. And when he was running from Saul, like before he was corrupted by actually getting the power, and then you see him like act out these like depraved things. I think I thought, oh no, this was when he was really sweet and godly and devoted back when he was a shepherd boy in the fields. He had tons of time.
When they wrote about those stories.
Tons of time in the fields watching his sheep to write Psalms.
Exactly. That's what happened. So they needed David, who was an obedient and faithful lawkeeper, as their agenda was defining and figuring out how to carry out life under the law without the temple in Jerusalem. The book became the center of Judaism. They recast David as someone who was an example and hero of the rabbinic law, the great rabbi of the golden age of Israel, before rabbis even existed, right? So they rewrote David as what they needed him to be in order to structure power and make their society work and their religion continue and their culture and all that stuff, right? There is no anything in the Bible that shows David as any of those things, okay? So I'm just trying to drive the point home. They took David and wrote his story differently. Right?
Everything is. It wasn't a character.
Right. During the Reformation, John Calvin used David as a symbol of piety. Again, nothing in the Bible suggests this, right? But see, Calvin was thinking.
Well, when he was younger, it did. When he was the shepherd boy.
What do you know about the shepherd boy David, other than that says he was a shepherd boy? What do you know about it? Nothing is said. Nothing is written about him being a shepherd other than go get your son. Oh, well, he's out tending the sheep. That's the only thing.
But then Okay, but then
there is no stories of him out in the desert singing songs and writing prayers and poems to God. That is all later tradition. Okay? This is what I'm saying. I'm telling you the story of David from the Bible. Okay? And that's not in there. But let me keep going because it's going to take forever if we keep taking these breaks. Okay?
A bunch of times when I know David.
Okay. Maybe you don't.
No, the character that the Bible talks about.
Well, anyway, we'll get to all this. Hold on. My point. I'm trying to drive a point home. So the early Jews in the first few centuries.
I'm trying to take your point apart.
God, the early Jews in the first few centuries, they rewrote David as who they needed him to be.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Even though there wasn't material that propped that up. Yes, there was tradition like you were taught, which probably comes from them, where it cast him as this holy shepherd boy who was so in touch with God and blah, blah, blah. But that's not in the Bible, okay? That is what you learned, but that is not in the Bible. My point is they rewrote him. And then John Calvin in the Reformation, he's breaking away from, he's a Protestant. He hates the Catholic Church and all the ritual and all the bullshit, and he's focused on being good and righteous and pious, right? And so David becomes the pious, righteous king. Again, none of that, from a narrative standpoint, is in the Bible. He had to rewrite him according to what he needed David to be. What is it? When I say the word David was a man, what's the next word you say?
After God's own heart.
That comes from fucking Calvin. It mentions it like one time in the Bible, but it became this huge tagline to David through the Protestant Reformation as they took David and turned him into the righteous.
All you needed is to say one time, and that's good enough to make
Apparently. Apparently. As the Zionist movement got going in the middle of the 20th century, they chose the Star of David as the symbol for the nation that they would create and build. Right?
Who did?
The Jewish flag. The Zionist movement. That's a return to Israel.
Okay,
Remember after World War II?
Okay. Yeah.
They're gonna have their own homeland.
Yeah.
Everyone said, let's do this. So go for it. And remember the whole war, and this starts the Palestinian and all this kind of shit, right? They looked at David in the Bible and decided to focus on his warrior activities and traits. They named weapons and plans after places, people, and events in the David stories. They needed the David and Goliath David, not any of the other stuff. They didn't need the weak little shepherd boy that you were talking about. They didn't. Hold on, listen to me and don't.
But you're saying that I said I see David and Goliath as the shepherd boy David going up, this meek boy going up against Goliath. I don't see him as a warrior going up against Goliath.
Well, because that's the way the story was framed to you.
Okay. I'm
saying the Zionist Jews definitely saw him as a mighty warrior.
Okay.
And they didn't name the things like, oh, we're so small. They named it because of the power and stuff of that they believed David should represent, right? So they wanted warrior David, right? And so places where he had battles and people he killed and all that kind of shit.
That was warrior David, but Goliath and David were not.
Okay, that's David. Fine if you. We're going to talk through this story, by the way. So you're saying stuff that we're going to talk about. Okay. But then back in the 70s and 80s, like when we were growing up in the church, David was like the half-naked guy unashamedly dancing in front of the Ark of the Covenant as brought into Jerusalem, right? I always taught this praiseful David, this David who just unashamedly didn't care. Well, this happened to be the time when like charismatic forms of evangelical Christianity are exploding. Hippie Jesus was ascendant. And so hippie David, a man after God's own heart, is obviously also the David that we were given. This is the David I was given, right? I could say like, well, he was a shepherd, he was a warrior. We could say all that stuff, but the David that was framed in my mind was more the David of like the psalmist David, right? The David that whatever.
I saw him as all of it. I learned all of it.
That's fine. I'm not arguing that they don't either. What I'm saying is these things are not supported by the narrative in the Bible doesn't support any of these things really as his true characteristics from the story.
Right.
Not the actual guy because we don't know.
Right.
But from the story. People rewrote his history selecting one of those characteristics and built a bunch of traditional legend around it because they had agendas at work, right? But what about today? Today, it's more MAGA David. He's the supposedly righteous but incredibly flawed hero who united the nation of Israel and got rid of all ungodliness. Yeah, he was essentially a criminal, terrorist, rapist, but God uses even the weakest of vessels to demonstrate his mercy and power, blah, blah, blah. That's the David of today, right? The point is, we negotiate with the Bible and the things written in there. Our version of the story or its essential message is always filtered through this process of framing it according to our agendas, largely based on socio-political realities and changes.
I've actually heard people tying why Trump is from God because of connecting him to David.
Hold that thought.
Are you going there? Okay.
This is my point, is that you keep going, well, I know that. Yes.
Yeah,
and there are a bunch of people who will tell you all the different versions of Trump. Is it all in there in the stories? Yeah. Yes, but they're rewriting it according to their fucking agenda. And that's what they did with David too. Okay? We aren't just now negotiating with the text of the Bible in the 21st century. We've been negotiating with the Bible and its contents since the very earliest of origins. Before it was even known as anything called the Bible, we can see this take place rather starkly in the way David plays out across the books he shows up in, right? So like I mentioned earlier, Samuel is the earliest probably of the Davidic content, possibly even originating during or shortly after the time of David itself, depending on your beliefs on if he was a real dude or whatever. What they do think, why do they think this? Why do they think Samuel is earliest? Well, in Samuel is where we find David, warts and all. But isn't some unbiased expose criticizing David. Instead, it's performing a kind of political spin regarding all the shit he did. It's like PR. It's like someone is writing pro-Trump material to people who are going like, yeah, but I mean, he did find guilty. Well, he was on Jeffrey Epstein's island. He was, people have all this idea, like why he isn't a good fit. And then people come along and reframe this whole story. Well, he wasn't actually ever there when girls, we start telling and spinning it to create plausible deniability, to separate him from events so that it's like, well, he didn't, maybe someone is counting it, but he never told him to do that. We hear all this all the time, right? Senator so-and-so was caught sending dick pics to a 15-year-old boy. Oh, it turns out he was hacked and the intern was fired. Sure, that's what happened, right? We know that's not what happened, but we spin. We create agendas and then we create stories to kind of fit that, right? So as it turns out, so did the people who wrote the stories of David found in the goddamn Bible, right? We aren't just now figuring this out or doing this. So in David, it's completely obvious spin that leads scholars to believe that the events that are described, in Samuel, even if given all kinds of fictional and legendary treatments, likely were real events and happened on some level. If they weren't, it would be weird to bring them up if you're trying to paint David as this chosen by God hero king. You would just be introducing stuff you'd have to explain later, making it harder work for yourself. It seems like there were likely people in ancient Israel who weren't really down with David because of all the shit they witnessed and heard about regarding his rise to power. This reads like the pro-David response to negative attitudes and opinions about him amongst the people, right? It sounds like propaganda. Because it doesn't say, David was so great, he did all these righteous things. It's, David was around all this fucked up shit, but it was never David. He never did it. He never wanted it. He didn't want that to happen, right? He's a man after God's own heart.
This is
Everyone's dying around him, but he didn't cause any of that.
This is disturbing me.
I know, it's good, right?
Because I have recently, in recent months, asked myself if I was still a Christian during these Trump years, would I have been taken in by this bullshit? Or would I have been one of the ones that are trying to speak against Trump within the church? Would I have been? Which one would I have been? And as vehemently as I am defending David now, I'm like, gross. I would have been maybe defending Trump because my brain worked like that, like believing these.
Yeah, I hate to admit it, but the answer to that question for probably both of us is probably.
Ew.
Yeah. So that's why I'm saying, like, this is like important stuff to confront.
I hate this shit.
I know. So here's the basic story of how it gets going and a quick overview of some of the stuff that happens as the tale of David unfolds in the Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So his origin story has all the markings of an ancient Near East legend. There were, just as today, literal frameworks that were common amongst across time spans, cultures, regions, religions, all throughout the ancient world. They kind of borrowed these literary devices, right? For instance, if I were to tell you about a woman for whom it was not safe to have a child, having a little boy in secret, putting him in a basket, covering it with pitch, setting it adrift on a river where he is found by someone who works in the royal palace. The baby boy is then adopted and raised in a manner he never would have had access to, who then goes on to be a very special and great leader of his people, blessed by God and providing a great law code to them. Who would that be? Moses. Well, actually, this is an account of the inscription found describing the birth of Sargon of Akkad, known to historians as the king of the first empire in human history. The legend likely dates back to around 2500 BC, about 1,000 years before the Moses events were supposed to take place. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is, I wanted to get you to understand that these are tropes. These are devices that were used all over the place. Okay. Did they steal Moses' story from Sargon? Probably. Yeah. Right? But not in a way that we would think in our modern world with copyrights and patents. It was common to use storylines and legendary frameworks and mythologies and even characters, right? To accomplish whatever their purpose was. They weren't trying to write truth for a bunch of white people in the 21st century. In Sargon's case, his name literally means legitimate, which means he wasn't, right? If you have to name yourself legitimate, you're trying to do some spin, some PR. Aren't you a bastard? No, my name's legitimate, dude. Okay. It's like in his legend, it's a temple prostitute. She's not supposed to have a baby. She has a baby, puts in a thing. The guy who's like the water bearer, the water drawer for the fucking royal palace finds him. He's raised. All the shit that happens to Moses, right? Yeah. And it all seems to serve the thing of like, yeah, we don't know who his dad was, and his mom was a temple prostitute, and basically he's born of lowly, not something the gods would do, but look what the gods did. They obviously chose him because they protected him and all this stuff and made sure that he ended up being ruler anyway. See, they're doing spin. Yeah. Because there are probably people saying, like, why should I listen to Sargon? The guy's a bastard. And then they say, well, yeah, but a bastard chosen by God. Here's the story, right? Yeah. So Moses, just kind of did that. The tale they crafted for Moses borrowed from these things, right? Yeah. So Samuel is born under another very popular origin story. The barren woman who cries out to God, possibly making a vow, only then to have a baby boy who goes on to do something special, important, or extraordinary, right? It happens with Sarah when she has Isaac. It happens with Rachel when she has Joseph. In the New Testament, it happens with Elizabeth when she has John the Baptist. Right? This is over and over and over and over. In our Christmas episode last year, we talked about how Christian legends around Mary were written, and they seem to borrow this same trope because it turns out her mother apparently and father couldn't have a kid, and then sure enough they prayed and they had Mary. So again, Mary becomes this legendary figure with this great birth story. Samuel's birth follows the same literary pattern, and he winds up being handed over to Eli, the priest at the temple, after he is born. In fact, the people who invented Mary's backstory are likely alluding to Samuel's tale, since in that extra biblical source, it says Mary's mother's name is Anna. And in the book of Samuel, we find out it's Hannah, right? And Hannah can't have a baby, and so she prays, and then she gets pregnant, and she says, I swear I'll give this kid up to God. And so when he's born, brings him to Eli, who's the priest at the temple, and says basically, well, this kid's yours now. And then they leave him there, right? And he's raised in the temple. So Eli runs the temple. He has two sons. They're kind of described as annoying bros in the story. They're not doing things right, and so God murders them out of his petty anger. God is such a dick in the Bible, by the way. Anyone who had the qualities of God in your life, you would fucking get rid of them so fast. But
Well,
yeah, God just kills them.
Some of us are attracted to abusive people.
Yeah, apparently. So Samuel, one night, Samuel hears God say, Samuel, or whatever, and Samuel's like, well, I don't know what the fuck that is, a dream or something. And so eventually he tells Eli, like, hey man, like, I keep hearing someone calling my name, and Eli goes, oh, that must be God. And so next time you hear the voice, you say, okay, I'm here, tell me what you want, or whatever. Anyway, Samuel grows up to become the last judge of Israel. So if you know the Bible in the Old Testament, there's a book called Judges. This is where stories like Samson, like we talked about him earlier. There's actually 12 judges, one from each of the tribes of Israel. Convenient, again, how that all got set up. And the judges were not kings. They were typically people who arose to leadership at times they were needed. They were not like sitting on a throne.
I think I would confuse them with prophets. I thought Samuel was a prophet. Or is that the same thing?
No, Samuel was a judge. A prophet. Okay, so some of the judges prophesied, but later the prophets would arise. But the prophets usually arose when there were kings to influence and counsel and things like that. So yes, you could call them prophetic, but they were more than that. They led military. They were like the revolutionary leaders that rose up.
Samuel was a judge?
He was the final judge. And when I say that, because Samuel's going to choose a king for Israel.
That's right.
He is the last judge of Israel before the kings start ruling.
Okay.
And so there were no kings in Israel before the lifetime of Samuel.
Right.
It is in his
that they chose
the
Saul.
Lifetime of that's being the story that's being told. Okay. Yeah. So Samuel, for all intents and purposes, grows up to be the most powerful figure in Israel.
True.
He's the judge.
Yeah.
He's not the king.
Okay.
He's not ruling. They're not his subjects, but he is recognized as the authority.
Okay.
He talks to God or whatever the fuck they thought.
That's why I think I perceived him as a prophet, because he talked to God and
But that's an important thing, is that Samuel is the most important. He's the one that everyone comes to.
Yeah.
But the people start going, we want a king.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I remember that part of the story.
Imagine you being essentially the leader. And people start going like, we want someone different, right? You got to put these human components into the story.
I remember the story. Now you're jogging my memory. I remember Samuel was heartbroken.
Right.
He was trying to convince them they didn't want a king. Like, this is not going to be good for you. You don't want a king. And they were like, yes, we do.
That's what the story says, is that they said that will not be good for you. Okay. I'm saying that.
Well, I'm just saying that.
I doubt that was what. Here's what happens. Samuel judges Israel. Like he's like the guy that people come to for advice and what to know.
Do we know if he was real?
So then, no, we don't.
We don't know if he was real or not.
Is there?
Are there
a real possibility? Yeah.
Did they actually have judges?
We believe so. Now, is that completely hyperbolic in the way that? Of course. Did Samson capture hundreds of foxes, tie their tails together with torches?
No, the story is right, but.
Was there a guy named Samson? Maybe. Maybe Samuel. Was he more like a legendary, Hercules figure?
Samuel. Are you talking about Samuel?
I'm talking about the judges in general. When you look at someone like Samson, there's highly mythologized content throughout the judges stuff, but they might be based on kernels of truth of. These are very small populations. They're not a big kingdom. We tend to think of this as this huge million people kingdom. These are very small disparate locations, little cities, little communities. And could one figure who then gets kind of lionized and legendized over time and becomes, like David maybe, right? So there probably were these figures in Israel. Does that mean they were all who they are in the Bible? No, not necessarily, but whatever. There seems to be a tradition, or at least a kernel of some kind of truth in that, okay? But anyway, Samuel's a judge, and the people start going we want a king, right? There was a lot of advantages to having a king, by the way. I know we were taught in Sunday school that, the people were sinning because God said he did. First of all, there's no God, so God wasn't saying shit. People said they wanted a king because it offered protection. There was a lot. This was a very rough place to live at this time. Imagine the wild, wild west, right? What did we want in the wild, wild west? We wanted towns and mayors, and we would become a state, so the federal government would fucking come in and deal with this bullshit. Yeah, that's what they wanted. And
I remember it being told it was what was the city, the places around were they had, and they wanted what they had, and that was against
Again,
God.
Like being worldly.
They wanted to
shut
be.
the
Yeah,
fuck
no, no.
up, right?
Yeah, no, no.
So
Yeah, no,
stupid.
no.
No, they looked
But they
around
were like
and said,
looking around,
wow.
going, "They're doing better than us."
That's exactly what they're doing.
We need to be doing that.
And God's like, no, you shouldn't want that.
You need to suffer and do things in a stupid way.
You should be living under this utter turmoil and bloody fucking feuds all the time. That's what you should do. Right? But anyway, so people want a king. And so, again, no God is talking to Samuel. So Samuel is being written as, and God told me to do this. Well, that's just fucking a guy that's deciding to do this. So he starts roaming around the country, basically looking for a king. I guess he's just thinking, well, I'll just know him when I see him.
Yep.
And they get to one town, and this dude stands up, and he's super tall, and everyone says, yep, that's the guy.
That's the guy.
And you're like, that's so dumb. That is how we fucking choose people today.
Yeah. Yes.
Don't what do they say? The last, I don't know how many presidential elections, the tallest candidate won.
Always won. Yep.
When you watch Love Island, if some short guy is the most amazing guy, he's fucked. Because some tall doofus piece of shit will walk in, and they're all like, he's so tall. Right? There is this weird thing in us. And so Saul ends up being a tall guy. Now, Saul is cast in the Bible and in anytime you were in church as an evil, wicked king who did all this terrible shit. Mm-hmm. I do not believe that is the case as you read the biblical narrative. If you look at it from Samuel's butt hurt that fucking they want a king and he's not going to be in control anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe he chose Saul because he thought, this guy's a fucking idiot. They want the tall guy. This guy's a fucking moron, whatever. But Saul winds up being king of Israel for 42 years.
Was he an actual king?
Probably. Yeah, it's likely that Saul, maybe, possibly, was. He could be he could be like a King John. I mean, Prince John figure from like Robin Hood, right? The evil king. And when you really look at the history of Prince John, he wasn't like that at all. But I mean, maybe
Saul in the beginning wasn't evil, but then he was like, seemed like he lost his mind.
Okay, the story tells you that.
Yeah, that's how this. I know.
We don't know that.
I know. I'm just saying about the story.
In the story, and this is all Samuel that gets to put the spin out. This is Samuel's version of the story. Mm-hmm. In his story, Saul was terrible. And so get this. So Saul's the king, and you got this fucker coming in and saying, God said that this about you. Okay.
Yeah, because Samuel would be like Samuel was connected with Saul still through the first part of his reign.
Yeah, I mean, there was an uneasy relationship.
Yeah.
Samuel was more like the guy that the king had to put up with because he would just walk in and say, thus saith the Lord. Mm-hmm. Well, the Lord didn't say shit to Samuel, so this is thus saith Samuel.
Yeah.
And so Samuel's version is, Saul he was so wicked and he didn't do, like one time, he was supposed to go. God said, go in there and kill all the men, all the women, all the children and babies, kill them all, and then kill all the animals and all the baby animals and all the pets and everybody. Everything has to die. Mm-hmm. This loving God, right? Well, Saul goes in and beats them, but he doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Probably on a human level, he's like, this seems unnecessarily. What God meant was go utterly conquer these people.
Yeah.
He doesn't mean he's not saying kill this little girl. Like, what the fuck does she do? Right. Mm-hmm. And of course, Samuel's like, well, you're wicked and disobeyed anytime. And I really feel like Samuel in the story, it appears like he's just gaslighting the fuck out of Saul because Saul's running into all these problems. And it's because Samuel is saying, well, God said this and God, well, it's God doing it. And so he goes crazy. Samuel's so pissed. And Saul's so pissed. Whenever he gets like raging mad, Samuel just goes like, wow, this guy's got an evil spirit. Mm-hmm. He's being tortured by an evil spirit. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe he's just pissed off because you're a prick and you're ruining everything and you're fucking seem to be throwing problems. In fact, in one place, it almost seems like Samuel entraps him. And so they go to fight the Philistines. That's the big enemy at this time in the Bible, the Philistines. And so Saul goes with the army to fight the Philistines. And they just get their asses kicked. And so they pull back from the battle, back to a place to recoup and replan and kind of launch another attack. Mm-hmm. But everyone's fucking scared shitless. And so Saul reaches out to Samuel like, hey, man, we need your help. The men are leaving. I need you to come and do your God shit to, basically morale and like make people. Samuel says, okay, yeah, I'll be there in so many days. And so Saul waits. Yeah. And his men are leaving every day.
Yeah.
People are taking off like, fuck this. And he waits and waits, and Samuel doesn't come. And the appointed time comes, and doesn't come. And he waits longer, and Samuel doesn't come, and Samuel doesn't come.
Yeah.
These are guys fighting supposedly a war against God's enemies on the side of God. And Samuel's like, fuck it. And so Saul finally goes, man, I got to do something. I'm going to lose all my men. We're going to get fucked up. We're going to get destroyed.
Yeah.
And so he decides, I'll do the sacrifice.
Yeah.
And so he does the burnt offering and all this shit.
Yeah.
Okay? The Bible says, as soon as he starts doing this, as soon as he finishes doing this thing, Samuel walks up and goes like, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. You're not allowed to do that. Only I'm allowed to do that. Mm-hmm. And because of this, God's going to choose someone else to sit on your throne. Mm-hmm. The throne's going to be taken from you, and he's going to bring a special anointed guy in, right? Come on. Like, from a human level, that's Saul's fucking is trying to completely upend. Samuel's trying to completely upend Saul's thing. When you look at it just from that perspective, when you remove all the thus said the Lord and God's anger burned against, none of that stuff's real.
Yeah. People
were doing this. Why were they doing that? Well, Samuel seems to be like, trying to make sure that he's as unsuccessful as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And so, over and over, Saul is always shown as this evil person, but when you look at it, really wasn't, right?
Yeah.
And so he's all troubled and all this stuff is going on. And so through the story, Samuel apparently is told by God to go and I will show you the person that I'm going to anoint to be king, right? And so somehow Samuel ends up, God, there's too many S's. Samuel ends up in Bethlehem at a guy named Jesse's house. If you ever wondered why your name is Jesse, that's why. It was the father of David is where we get that name from. And, he has all these sons, and they're all big, strapping, fucking burly dudes. They all look pretty nice. And he's going by, and he's looking at each one, and it's like, nope. And he gets to the end of all his sons. He's like, you don't have any other sons? This is all you got? He's like, well, I got this one runt of the litter, basically. He's out shepherd boying because that's what we let him do. And Samuel says, okay, well, I'm not leaving, so you got to bring all the sons. That's what I need to look at. I need to see all your sons. And so he brings David, and remember, David gets anointed. And Saul, again, the Bible says he's having this troubling evil spirit is making him mad or whatever, which, again, I think he's just mad because everything I do, Samuel is fucking trying to fuck up, and I can't do anything to him because he's supposedly the prophet of God or whatever. Yeah. And if I can, then people will turn up. And so he's like in this situation and fucking pissed off. And he gets so mad that, they decide, well, I hear this kid out in Bethlehem can play music pretty well. Like, bring him in. And so they bring Daniel in, and he's this boy, and he's David. I'm sorry. They bring David in. See, got too many D's too. They come in, and he's playing, and it soothes Saul, right? Yeah. You've heard the story. Yeah. This is where the shepherd, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And that never gets mentioned again, by the way. And it's even weirder because the next scene is Saul is out going to battle against the Philistines. This is the Goliath scenario, okay? And so David goes out and kills Goliath, right? Or does he? Here's the question, right? Because all the Bible people will be like, in 1 Samuel 17:50, it says, so David prevailed over the Philistines with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Okay, that's Goliath is the Philistine being spoken of there. That's a story you know, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is we also had 2 Samuel 21:19 available to us, and it never seemed to get brought up. And in 2 Samuel 21:19, it says, then there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So the Bible says 2 different people killed Goliath.
Weird.
We just go with the David thing, and then I've even heard them say he killed Goliath, David, with a stone and a sling, and his spear was as big as a weaver's beam. Okay, well, that detail comes from the story that says a guy named Elhanan from a different guy in Bethlehem killed Goliath. So they conflate the 2 stories, get rid of Elhanan and just say David did it. But the writers of 1 and 2 Samuel seem to have 2 differing traditions about what... which leads to believe maybe more than one person wrote this, or it was redacted together later from multiple sources, right? Both these details were there. They didn't know which one was right. Put them both in. Let someone else deal with it kind of situation.
And which part says that David chopped off his head after he died?
Oh, that's in the 1 Samuel account, yeah. Okay. All that shit. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. Let's just say David killed Goliath. He winds up being appointed by Saul as a military leader, and he goes out and kicks ass against the hated enemy of Israel at this time, the Philistines, right? So that's kind of David's entrance into kind of the royal scene, right? The upper echelons of Israelite power. It's interesting, too, in the Bible that at this point, David's apparently been playing for Saul, soothing the savage beast with his music. And yet, when David shows up and fights Goliath, Saul's like, who is this kid? I've never seen him before. That's weird, too, right? Because when you think like, wait, isn't that the guitar kid? Isn't that the kid who just played, the cool covers that I like or whatever? No one said that. He's just like, who is this kid? Oh, that's David. Like, it's weird. So, again, it seems like there's multiple stories that maybe were floating around, and these have been kind of conflated together. So, anyways, he goes off, and he becomes this great military leader in Israel. David does. Yeah. And this is all, and he does so with a very, 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 very good friend of his named Jonathan, who was Saul's son. Now, no other relationship in the Bible, none, is described in the way that David and Jonathan are described. This has led a lot of discussion around the nature of it. And, of course, we do it through our own modern context, which is very steeped in this idea that there's some moral issue with same-sex relationships, stuff like that. But I'm telling you, go read the Bible. Read what it says about David and Jonathan. It talks about how they delighted in each other. They talked about how they loved each other more than the love of women. Yeah. There's a scene where David and Jonathan are talking, and Jonathan takes off all his clothes and hands it to David, and then they walk off into the woods together, basically. Okay, so at this time, were these relationships looked down upon? We don't necessarily think so. That seems to be a very modern thing that's happened along the way in interpreting things like homosexuality. So, yes, the Bible has some of this stuff, but I would contest that maybe those things came much, much, much later. Because we have ample evidence of not only gay and lesbian and even trans or bisexual kind of people existing in ancient history. We do. They were even venerated, and oftentimes they were the spiritual power. Many of the goddess temples that were all throughout, even ancient Israel, by the way, we do have tons of archaeological evidence for them worshiping goddesses alongside Yahweh in their temples. And it often depicted women with cocks, like trans ideas. And so this didn't seem to be a prohibition. It's never mentioned as such in the text, right? And so, people argue over this and they get all crazy about it. But in reality, I mean, it does seem like they were lovers. They were partners in a very, very real sense, right? So Saul and Jonathan, David and Jonathan was Saul's son. David and Jonathan are like buddies. Now, it is weird when you really look at it. It's a lot of Jonathan loving David, whereas it seems like David might be using him a little bit because it doesn't have the same thing reciprocated from David, which I don't know. I just picked up on that while I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, it's interesting. Jonathan's into David. I think David might be conveniently using that fact in order to do stuff, right? Because we're going to see some shit's going down here that underlies everything, right?
Something happens and there's a rift between them.
No. But we'll get there.
Okay.
So they're out doing battle. David and Jonathan, they're fucking awesome. They're kicking ass. And so fangirls start singing songs about David and Saul, King Saul, right? And they're going, Saul's killed his thousands and David has killed his tens of thousands, right? And so now Saul feels kind of like Howie in the Backstreet Boys. You're like, who? Exactly, right? He's in there, but he's nothing compared to Nick or whoever the fuck you like, right? My point is like, Saul's like, hey, I'm the king. Saul's been he's been fucking commanding the army. He's maintained the nation of Israel. And now they're saying David is better. And so Saul's finally like, fuck this, dude. I'm going to kill this little motherfucker, right? And this is what they did back then, by the way. People are like, that's so wicked. That's how fucking everything happened, okay, back then. And so David, so he's going to kill. David hears about it. So David runs off to the hills, and he starts gathering men around him, and he ends up having a band of like 400 men living as essentially outlaws out in the outer kind of wilderness areas, apparently raiding villages and robbing people traveling through. It's a gang, essentially, right? He even eventually becomes a mercenary group working directly for the Philistines. Yeah, he works and kills and does battle and does stuff with and for the Philistines, the people he was just fighting.
Yeah.
Right. And everyone goes through, all these apologists will go through, the Bible says he was tricking. Well, the Bible says they roll into a Philistine town and he gets scared because he thinks they're going to kill him. And so he starts acting crazy and drooling all this stuff. And they're like, whoa, get this guy away from us.
Yeah.
But once he figures out that, they're not going to kill me, they don't see me as that, he basically ingratiates himself. It was just a way to like avoid any violence on the outset. But then next thing you know, he's given his own town, his own Philistine city for his men to live in. Like he's on their side essentially at this point. And Saul over in Israel wants to kill him. So this is where some really dicey shit goes down, right? So we learn really quickly here that David gets a wife. Her name is Abigail. Do you remember that?
Yep.
Do you remember the story?
Oh, vaguely.
Okay.
Give me some things that'll...
So Abigail was married to a guy named Nabal.
Yes.
Nabal was a rich guy. He had a really great operation.
Yes.
He wasn't a bad guy. Nothing like that is suggested. He just happened to be a wealthy man in this region. He probably had lots of land and lots of servants and lots of all this shit, right? Resources. David shows up with his 400 guys with their swords and says, hey, nice farm you got. I've noticed no one's bothered you or like, you haven't had any trouble since we've been around. Like, maybe you should give us some of that stuff. I wouldn't want anything to happen to your nice place. Now, when we watch a movie today, and a guy in a suit from the 40s that goes in with a hat, and he walks in and he says, "Ooh, nice laundromat. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. How about you pay me?
My boss.
Pay me." Okay, isn't that what we would think? Okay, that's what happens in the David story. Okay, but Nabal says, fuck you. Fuck you. I'm not going to do it, right? Nabal says, you're a scoundrel. No. So David goes back to his camp. He goes back to his camp and he tells his men, all right, guys, let's go fucking kill this motherfucker. That's what he's going to do. The man after God's own heart, this is what he's doing, okay? First he tries to pull a protection racket on him and it doesn't work. So now we're just going to kill him and take his shit. Well, Nabal's wife, Abigail, hears about this and goes, fuck. And so she starts gathering all this shit. She bakes all these cookies or whatever. She gets all this stuff together and she puts it on a donkey and she sends it out to David and basically falls on her face and like, hey, don't kill us. Here's his shit. He's being dumb. That's what she's doing, right? This is what could happen, right?
Yeah.
And David basically says, well, we're still going up there. And so they show up at the house. And then the story basically goes on to say, like, and wouldn't you know it, Nabal got so scared, he just wound up dead from a heart attack. Now, in a modern story, when we learned that the mobsters went into a laundromat, the laundromat owner said, fuck you, I'm not doing that. And then the next day, the laundromat ended up dead. And the mobster says, like, I don't know, it must have been a heart attack.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is clearly, again, PR. This is spin.
Yeah.
Well, what about Nabal? Well, David didn't kill Nabal. God did. Because, he wasn't sharing his stuff with God's anointed king. Well, no. David is a Philistine raider at this point. Yeah. He is a fucking bad guy. And he's going and trying to force this guy under threat of violence. And when he says no, he winds up dead. What do you think happened? Anyway, he winds up with Abigail, his wife, out of this, which is weird, right? So again, remember, David is actually allied with the Philistines, fighting and killing with and for them during this time. That's like when we've had American soldiers who have defected over to ISIS.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what we think of that?
Have we had that happen?
Yes, we've had that happen.
Oh,
right? Yeah. And what was that guy's name? Jihad John or whatever. Yeah. Like we've had people, and then they've gone on to help and aid and even operate in ways that killed Americans.
Right.
When they come back over, we have serious questions, right? Or whatever. And that's what's really going on here. This is what the Israelites would have seen David as at this time.
Yeah.
They are not all running around going like, our anointed king isn't here. We have evil Saul. They're like, no, David fucking went nuts and joined the enemy, and he's out there killing people, right? Because that's what was happening.
And I don't think that the people overall knew. I think that it was a kind of a secret thing that Samuel had anointed him. It wasn't known until, it wasn't revealed till later.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. And all we have is the narrative.
I mean, that's in the story.
Yeah, that's all we have is the story. So yeah, that's right. It's not like he walks around with a T-shirt or anything saying, "I'm God's anointed," whatever. It is true. It was like something that supposedly Samuel and God put together, which is kind of fucked up. Then that they didn't say anything, and now all this is going anyway. So the text also makes sure to show multiple times that David had opportunities to assassinate Saul. One time it says Saul had to take a shit. That's what the Bible says. Yeah. And he goes into a cave to take a shit.
Yeah, no, I remember this.
But David and his men were fucking hiding in the back of the cave from him. They'd been chasing around this mountain right around. So now they're like, fuck, that guy's in here taking a shit and we're back here. And so one of David's guys goes, hey, man, just go fucking kill him. This is your shot. God's delivered him into your hands. And he goes up, remember, and he cuts a piece off his cloak, and he shows it later, like, you were taking a shit, and I could have, again, all to frame David as this righteous, good guy who just doesn't want to do any violence. Yeah. I'm not a violent guy. I don't do that, kind of situation. But we're going to see. I mean, we've already seen. He does. Other shit goes down. David and his men kill a bunch more people. And every death is somehow not David's fault or doing, and yet every death directly benefits him and only him. Like, all these people are dying just makes his path to the throne easier. And the writer of Samuel is saying, like, but I mean, this was God, obviously, doing all this. It wasn't David doing this. This wasn't any kind of, like, manipulating circumstances and intrigue. This was just God working his mysterious ways and killing a bunch of innocent people to like make his point, apparently. So again, it's like, it's a shame that's not relevant to our times. That all of this leads up to the final showdown between the Philistines and Saul's Israelite army. Even though David has been fighting with the Philistines, Samuel makes sure to show that, and put a little detail in it. It shows that, basically has that one of the Philistine leaders, because they kind of had, we call them kings. When I say like the king of Israel, maybe a better word would be mayor. Yeah. There were kings in Egypt. Yeah. There were kings in these places, right? Yeah. These were little backwater fucking nothings places, right? So it's the Philistines, each city basically had a warlord leader. Yeah. They called them kings. That's kind of maybe a way that we would misrepresent that in our minds based on what we know of a king. And so one of these Philistine rulers said, hey, David, I like you. Okay. These other guys, I don't think they trust you. So you better sit with this one out. So again, Samuel makes sure to like write in a little detail like David wasn't even there, kind of situation. Like he was over here and here's why. And so Israel gets its ass kicked. And in the fight, Saul is wounded by an arrow. The enemy is closing in. He's about 72 at this point, by the way. It says he took power at 30. He took the throne at 30. And then he ruled for 42 years before he died. So this would mean he's 72. He's an older man for this time, right? So he takes an arrow. And the story we learn in the Bible here is that he knows he's done for. The fucking Philistines are coming. Their chariots and horses are coming. He knows they're going to do terrible things to them if they get a hold of him. And so he tells his armor bearer, hey, man, kill me. Yeah. Get this over with. Yeah. And the armor bearer says, no. He's probably conflicted. Yeah. And so Saul says, fuck it, fine. And he does it. Yeah. And he falls on his own sword, essentially, kills himself. Armor bearer sees this, does the same. Yeah. Okay, that's the story we get, right? Right. Or is this what happened, right? Because as 2 Samuel opens up, an entirely different story unfolds as we turn our attention over to David. He's chilling over in Ziklag. Yeah. That's the Philistine town that he was given by the Philistines. And remember, he was told to sit this battle out. So he's over in his home base with his dudes, right? So David's minding his own business out front, apparently, when an Amalekite runs into town and heads for David. So this dude runs in, his clothes are all torn, he's all dirty, and he beelines right for David, right? He doesn't run around going, where's David? Who's in charge here? He goes right for David. Remember, he's got 400 men. There's a lot of people roaming around here. Apparently, he knows David, goes right to David, right? So he goes up to David and he explains to him that, hey, I escaped from the Israelite camp, and I'm coming to tell you that Saul and Jonathan are both dead. Mm-hmm. Okay. So David asks him how he knows that this is the case, and then we get a very different tale of what went down with Saul, right? Mm-hmm. The Amalekite messenger proceeds to tell David that he was crossing the battlefield when he came across Saul, quote, leaning on his spear, right? He's wounded, and he's like, not in good shape. In this story, Saul asked the Amalekite guy to do the deed and kill him before the Philistines arrive to reach him as well, right? And this guy actually tells David, and so I did.
Yeah.
I killed him, right?
Yeah.
And then, after he explains what just went down, he pulls out the crown and the royal armband of Saul and hands it to David. Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, set the scene. Mm-hmm. You're on the enemy's side. One of the guys fighting on your side comes into town, tells you the king is dead. Mm-hmm. Here's his crown and shit. Mm-hmm. Why didn't the Philistines? Why didn't the Philistine leaders who defeated Saul have that? Well, there's a bunch of questions, but he gives it to David, right? So, oh yeah. So as soon as David hears this, he takes the crown, he rips his clothes, he makes a big show of, oh no, Saul and Jonathan, right? Even though they've been running around and fighting each other or whatever. They're dead. And so he has everyone has to fast until sundown. The fast to show this, like, I'm super bummed. And as soon as the fast is over, David has the Amalekite guy killed. Okay. Mm-hmm. Effectively silencing him from saying anything else. Mm-hmm. Again, just putting this into human perspective. Does it seem like this was not arranged ahead of time or not? Like, it sounds like this Amalekite guy had orders to bring this crown to David, as if David kind of arranged all this ahead of time. It wouldn't work any other ways, unless you inserted God into the picture. Mm-hmm. But when you take God out of the picture, this seems like just human intrigue. This is David setting this up. And then, you kill the spy because, or you kill the messenger because you don't want him saying anything else. Mm-hmm. What if he says, well, David told me to bring him the crown? Well, you don't want to hear that because you're the anointed king. You got to conquer this land, right? And so, let's see. So off David goes now with the crown, killing and murdering along the way. He had to conquer his own people. These people did not bow down as David rode into town. They fought him in the north and the south. There were royal families. There were elites. There were people that were contenders or in line to the throne. There was a lot of factions happening, right? And so they weren't all just going like, oh, David's God's anointed king? Well, why didn't you tell us? Come on in. That didn't happen, right? And so this set off a period of extreme violence against Israelites, okay? We're almost done here. So, for example, there's this one leader named Abner who was pro-Saul. However, one of Saul's sons caught him fucking one of Saul's concubines, which is a big no-no, and got him to hot water. Now, I say caught. The Bible says one of Saul's sons accuses Abner of fucking one of the concubines. You weren't allowed to do that, okay? Abner gets so offended that you would even think he would do such a thing that he says, you know what? I'm going over to David's side then, right? Now, come on. He got caught, right? He obviously did get caught. Saul's gone. It was much different than just let's have sex with these beautiful women. The concubines were actually a part of the power structure of the kings. There was a lot of stuff. That's how you made more kings, right? If you had babies through them, they became sons of the king. And so getting access to a king's concubines and doing that was a serious, serious no-no, right? You weren't allowed to do that. That's why they had eunuchs in there. They'd cut dudes' balls off, right? Yeah. So this guy Abner goes in, slips in, and fucks one of Saul's concubines, or many of them apparently. One of Saul's sons says, hey, you can't do that. And he's like, what? You think I would do that? And he says, fine, I'm going to David's. Well, he goes to David's royal palace, where David does this big show of like, oh, okay, yeah, welcome. And then he winds up dead. Again, we're told in the narrative that, this wasn't David's doing. David didn't kill him. It was David's general, and he had a grudge because his brother was killed by Abner in a battle, and they did this elaborate thing. But in all likelihood, again, every contender to the throne winds up dead. Even David's sons eventually, throughout his rule, wind up dead. And it's all cast as this, like, David would never wanted to this. But it was David who was pursuing his sons to kill them.
Who were his sons again?
Like Absalom was one of them. There were others.
Yes.
Solomon becomes king. But the other sons that are trying to usurp the throne, they get into trouble. In Absalom's case, the story is, his hair got caught in a tree, and that's why he got killed. And then, Joab came up and killed him, found him hanging helplessly from this tree. It wasn't that he was just murdered to, keep David's power solidified. Well, he was, right? And so what I'm saying is the story of David in the Bible, in Samuel, is all political spin.
Yeah.
You can see how problematic all this stuff is.
Yeah.
But then along comes someone that's pro-David and says, no, I can explain all this away. Yeah, he was near there, but he didn't do that. No, he didn't kill that guy. Yes, it was good for him that guy died, but he didn't do it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So real quickly, we're at the end here. So that's the story of David through Samuel, right? But let's look at just how else was David then? Like, because remember we talked about Kings and Chronicles. They come centuries later, and they write very different stories. They emphasize different things about David. They don't mention a lot of things that Samuel mentions, right? Because they had very different agendas and needs. Samuel's agenda, whoever wrote Samuel, the books of Samuel, apparently was explain away all the terrible shit David did in order to convince people that he's the rightful king.
Yeah.
That he's legitimate to be king.
Yeah.
That he's not disqualified. He just killed so many Israelites. How do we get away with that?
Yeah.
Right? But and then eventually what we see in Samuel's writing, though, is eventually we get to the parts where David does start looking bad. And this was another very, very common thing in the writing of that time period. When one king was going to rise, the other had to fall a little bit. It was real common. We do this still. Yeah, I voted for someone running for president. Well, I voted for the president too, but he sucks and I can do better, right? We always diss. Yes, we were on their side before, but now I want to win. And so I got to fucking diss this guy, right? Hillary and Obama, they went after each other hard. They were on the same side essentially, but, in order to do, the same thing was going on then. And so what we see in the later parts of the Davidic narratives in the books of Samuel is that David all of a sudden starts being blamed for things. Things do show up that show him as kind of a dickhole. David and Bathsheba happen in these stories, right? And if you don't know that story, David now is the king over, again, a united monarchy and a powerful Israel. Did not exist. We have no archaeological evidence. But in this mythology, this legend, it's this giant kingdom. He's no longer out fighting battles. He's solidified his power. He's living the life of a privileged king. And he's walking around on, I think, his roof or some shit, and he sees Bathsheba. Apparently she was super sexy or whatever. I don't know. This probably didn't happen. But, and he basically just says, hey, go get her. I'm going to fuck her. And he basically does. Now, a lot of people say, did he rape her? Did he not? Was there consent? That is not something that was discussed in any of this writing or anything like that, right? They had those concepts of what rape was and things like that, but it probably fit different things. So I'm not going to make a comment on whether David raped her or not or whatever. Some people go that far. I don't know. But Bathsheba is married to one of fucking David's military guys named Uriah the Hittite. He's kind of a badass and a super loyal soldier because David fucks his wife while he's gone. She ends up pregnant. And now David's in trouble, right? Obviously. And so he cooks up the scheme and has his general bring Uriah back from the front lines. Hey, man, let's give this guy a break. He's doing great. We'll give him a little furlough so he can come back and get some R&R. And then he'll bang his wife, and he'll think that his wife's baby is his, right? Yeah. And that everything will be tied up in a nice bow, and we're out. Everything's fine, right? Well, Uriah comes back and says, I'm not going to go fuck my wife. My men are out sleeping in the dirt, bleeding. And he pitches his tent in the fucking doorway of the palace.
Yeah.
And David's like, fuck, of course I had to pick goddamn G.I. Joe's wife, whatever. And so anyway, he ends up instead having Uriah sent into really, really fierce fighting, and then told his generals to pull all the men back so that Uriah's all alone, and then he gets murdered, and that solves the issue.
Yeah.
And in this case, even though it's not a lot different than the other shit he did, that was all talked about how great and godly it all turned out to be.
Yeah.
This time, though, he gets in trouble.
He's held accountable.
Yeah, I mean, it's like very similar to kind of like stuff that went on in other kind of like engagements between like men of God and kings. But he's like tells them a story about this one guy has a bunch of sheep, and this one guy had just one little sheep.
Yeah.
And then one guy with a bunch of sheep took the little sheep and killed it. Blah, blah, blah. And David's like, find that motherfucker. We're gonna he's you, because you took Bathsheba, right? And in fact, in the story, the Bible, God is so pissed off at this, God murders the baby inside of Bathsheba, by the way. So if you're talking about how God considers infants so precious and we should have them all happen, he didn't think so. He kills babies all over the place, both in and out of the womb throughout the Bible. So he punishes David by killing his baby inside Bathsheba, who did nothing in this. Bathsheba is not guilty in this at all, but she gets obviously fucked over. But then he takes her as his concubine wife, whatever, and she ends up being the mother of Solomon, right? And so, but you start to see these slides. So yes, it's a terrible story that shows David in a terrible light, and it introduces Solomon, who's probably now on the throne as these stories are being written, and they're creating his myth and legend.
Yeah.
And his dad had to fall, and his son had to set. From his to rise, kind of situation. And so we start to see that go on, right?
Yeah.
So that's the story of David according to the book of Samuel in the Bible. The one that all the meat and the juicy details, that's where all the good stuff is, right? Totally manipulated for sure. But what about Kings and Chronicles? Do they add other details? So we're not going to spend a lot. I'm not going to take you through. I'm not going to do that. But let's talk about, I'm just going to summarize for you what each those books do with David and why we think they did that with David, right? So it's more like they wrote totally different David stories, okay? So, for instance, in Kings, which most scholarship estimates is being composed possibly sometime in the 6th century, so the 500s BCE, based on the content, language, and other clues, David is written as the perfect, wise, and righteous king. At this time, the United Kingdom had split, right? The United Kingdom supposedly under David, which again, there's no evidence for. But any semblance of whatever that was, that united political structure, they had fallen apart, and there were rulers in the north and rulers in the south.
Yeah.
Okay. Different kingdoms, different things going on, right? So in it, the writers criticize the vast majority of these kings as bad, and they often use the refrain, they did evil in the sight of the Lord, unlike their father David. Now, in the story I just told you, does that really work? No. But that's what they needed, and it was 500 years later. They didn't fucking know. And so they wrote David as the king we need. He is the the make Israel great king again, right? Back then, it was great. And it was because David was such a good king. He obeyed God so thoroughly. And these guys are such assholes, and they keep fucking everything up. And so that's how David is used throughout Kings. Such and such became king. Not like David, his father, who was awesome, and yet he wasn't, but that's what they needed, and so he gets rewritten, right? By the time Chronicles was written, sometime maybe around 400 BCE or even later, so now we're talking like 500 years after the supposed time of David, there were no more kings in Israel. They were under Persian rule. A perfect king wasn't even possible. The power dynamic and social structure had shifted towards the priests as the center of the authority, and it was their turn to use David to legitimize and prop up their centrality and power, right? There were no kings. There couldn't be kings. They were ruled by a foreign leadership. They had their own king. That was their king now. And so their societal, cultural, and their kind of local political structure shifted to the priests. It wasn't the kings anymore. Now the priests were in charge. Well, the priests needed David to be something different, right? So this meant having to tie David closely to the temple and its operations. It is in Chronicles where David is called a man after God's own heart, by the way. Okay, that's the only place. He's not called that in Samuel ever. He's not called that in Kings ever. But he is called that one time, I think, in Chronicles. And then it became his defining feature to like tons of people, which is crazy. It's also here that David is refashioned as the actual founder of the temple itself. In Samuel, we're told that David purchases the land and makes an altar, but God says he can't build the temple because of all the raping and murdering, right? He's like, no, sorry, there's too much blood on your hands.
Yeah, I remember that.
God, man after my own heart.
Yeah.
But your son Solomon's going to do it, right? You know that. That comes from Samuel.
Yeah.
Okay. However, in Chronicles, David is written to not only have bought the land and set up the altar, but he also drew up the plans, acquired the material, hired the workers, appointed the guards, oversaw the construction, and even developed the liturgical practices and rituals performed within. All that stuff happened long after David was dead, right? But Chronicles is the priests, and they're trying to organize power. And they know that who they need to tie themselves to is David. And so they need to tie David to the temple. If David is the great founder of the temple, right? Yeah. Well, we're his descendants. Yeah. Whereas the kings were like, we're the descendants of David's as kings and rulers. Well, that's no longer possible anymore. And so David is told to do all this stuff. There's no Bathsheba in Chronicles, no murderous rampages, no working with the Philistines, nothing like that, right? No Nabal and Abigail, none of these things happen. It's just he's this amazing founder of the temple, and that means that whoever works in the temple are the ones who really are chosen by God to be in charge. We work in the temple, man, that's amazing. So like this is what Chronicles is being written for, right? This is very human shit happening. It's not God-breathed or inspired or inerrant at all. Just like how whoever wrote the birth narratives of Jesus fashioned their legends based on their need to tie him back to David in order to retroactively provide him with legitimacy as the promised Messiah. They made up a story using some other made-up stories in order to accomplish what they were trying to accomplish, right? Yeah. They weren't writing truth or an accurate account, right? Yeah. And so the writers of the Old Testament are doing the exact same thing as the writers of the New Testament. They did it with David in the Old Testament. They're doing it with Jesus using David in the New Testament, right? Is it possible? Oh, wait. So hold on. Do you really think they had a complete genealogy of some backwoods tradesman living in Nazareth or in Matthew's case, Bethlehem? No, come on. Let's just be realistic. Did they have Joseph's little scroll they pulled out and, oh, look at that, 42 generations back, you go back to David? No, this was clearly a literary creation. Yeah. This was a story with details that were invented in order to accomplish that goal of tying Jesus to David through Joseph, right? Does it make sense to believe that? Even if there was some way to accurately trace his ancestry to an actual historical figure of David, would it really mean anything? Or prove the rest of the Jesus story must be true? Is it possible that we are engaging in the same activities as the biblical authors? Are we just taking previous material, mythologies, and stories and simply reframing and rewriting them in order to structure power and legitimacy that benefits our own political and social agendas? Yeah. Are the leaders idiots keep electing in our country based on their belief in the Bible, simply crafting convenient interpretations and retellings that explain how God thinks their ideas, opinions, and worldviews are the only true ones, while all others are wrong, even evil? You think so? I think so. Yeah. Right? And if all of this is just legendary treatment in order to get an agenda and message across to a contemporary audience living thousands of years ago, should we really be casting our votes today based around our feelings around it?
No, we should not.
And that's why I wanted to talk about this, because people would say, like, who cares about the Bible? Blah, blah, blah. Hey, man, unfortunately, you need to. Because all this crazy shit that's happening somehow in a large section of the forces motivating those things, whether it be anti-LGBTQ stuff, whether it be anti-immigration stuff, anti-women stuff, anti-whatever, right? The stuff we are hearing in our culture war right now being driven by one side is completely based in their interpretation and their mythologizing around these mythologies that were mythologizing and legendizing other mythologies and legends. And maybe that isn't a good framework to choose our leaders from.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, maybe what they think about what this thing has to say is fucking not anything that we should consider. Because everybody has their own, because that's what it lends itself to, because there's just no way to know what the fuck is real and what's not. You know? Yeah. So that's our Christmas episode today. I know it's been a long one, but it's a chance for us to catch up for all the missed episodes. And also, you know, I think as we come to this end of this very crazy season in American history, and as much as I hear about Christianity and the Bible being the thing that is justifying the very terrible things being said and
it
done.
It makes sense to me now how they're tying it, because I wasn't getting it. I'm like, I'm sorry, what? I don't understand. But then when you look at the Bible like that, what you just went through, it's like, oh, that's how they're tying Trump right now as being like it's mind-boggling to me that there's people saying like he's the man chosen by God to do this. It makes sense now.
Right.
But I mean, not not that it makes sense like it's a good thing. It makes sense how people can get their minds to say that to them and really believe it. I'm like, have you lost your fucking mind? But we've been doing that about these stories, and I would have been right along with it.
The Bible is one of these stories. Well, I should say the Bible. The books of the Bible each represent a kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
And in the future, we'll maybe talk more about, like, how did we get the Bible? We actually know quite a bit about how maybe possible. Again, these are a lot of theories based off of evidence, and there's a lot of theories because the evidence is not clear on everything. Again, we don't have the original, so a lot of this is just what's most probable and what's most likely. But we'll talk about how the Bible came together and how, you know, this was not men sitting down and writing this coherent story. This is and one of the myths about the Bible is a book. It's not a book. It's a library. It's an anthology. It's a collection of ancient Near East literature that came out of a particular people group there and was collected over years. There are many there are things in the Bible. There are books quoted in the books of the Bible that we don't have. Right? There's like books like the wars of the annals of the wars of Yahweh. That gets quoted in the Bible. We have we have nothing. So it's like the Bible is one of these stories. Yeah. Well, it is just the same thing we're doing now. Yeah,
and people would say people that attack the Bible and try to delegitimize it are just hate God and hate the Word of God because it's true and it's convicting to them, and
they want to sin.
And the actuality is the reason that we go after the Bible to delegitimize it and make it people aware that it's the myth that it is not out of like it's like, oh my God, people are going to follow it. We better, because it's God. It's like, no, people are going to follow it, and it's causing harm to our society and our civilization.
Exactly.
And people need to be freed so that we can have a better version of humans being civilized together.
Exactly.
Because we love humans and our society and our civilizations that we're trying to create above
That's the beauty of the Bible. It's a mirror, right? It's not a magic portal to see beyond. It's a mirror that reflects directly back to us and what we've been doing for millennia, which is a good reason to not completely not look at it. Exactly. But like, look at it and like exactly the way fucking it's like you said, use it as it. We wouldn't even be talking about it like this if it just maintained just the fucked up beliefs of people in their personal lives, and that guy believes the Bible. That's not where it stays in our society. It gets elevated to like this guidebook for America. People find America in the Bible. That's how fucking crazy it is.
Yeah.
And so the idea is God is sending them secret messages, and then they get to determine who to hurt based on that. And that is terrible.
Yeah.
A lot of people believe a lot of fucked up shit in this country, and they believe it based off of nonsense writings. We don't talk about that because they don't fucking end up using it as the reason why they get to oppress people. It becomes, oh, that's just weirdo. You know, that's just whatever.
Or we fight against it if it's not our prescribed book.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, we would say, well, that's not real. The Bible's real, you know, kind of thing. So it is important. I also don't expect people to go and read any of those books I read. Or if you're interested, man, just hop on YouTube and start watching Bible scholars. Now, if they start by telling you that they're, you know, going to show you why the Bible is true and all these evil college professors are wrong, yeah, skip that one because there's a shit ton of that out there. You got to go look at who actually is doing this work, who's dedicated their lives and actually know what they're talking about, and you will learn fascinating things about yourself, about us as a humanity. And kind of how we got here. So it's cool. And you'll also be able, you know, that's the thing is that book, The Atheist Guide to the Old Testament, Volume 1 and 2, I talked about at the outset. That sounds really, really like, oh, see, atheists are just trying to make fun of Christians. That's not why he called it that.
Yeah.
And his name's Dr. Joshua Bowen. If you get on YouTube and you go to a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi, that is him and his wife. They are both Assyriologists. Those are people who, I mean, these people know cuneiform and Phoenician and Akkadian and Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, right? Yeah. And ancient other languages, Aramaic, like that we talked about with the Tel Dan state. These people have studied under the most, you know, incredible scholars ever to look at this material. So he wasn't approaching it as like, let me just tell you why everything's wrong. It was, hey, what I find is when people who don't believe in the inerrancy of Scripture and don't believe in God and stuff like that, when they're faced with having to explain why that is, many people can't. Because this just isn't something that you run into in your everyday life. The state of biblical scholarship and archaeology and all of stuff, right? Around these cultures. So he wrote the book just to say, here, I will encapsulate for you what is currently known about these things. What we found, you know, and they're big books. There's a lot of material in there. And that's the point, is to just give you the scholarship that backs up what it is that, you know, you think of the Bible. So it's not like, oh, it's for atheists who hate God. No, he would never say that. He's like, I don't hate God and I don't hate the Bible. I don't personally believe in God and I don't believe the Bible, but I don't hate them. I love these concepts. I've dedicated my life to studying them. But people also find themselves in situations where they know they're right in the fact that that person isn't saying something that's true, but I can't articulate that because I don't know all the details. And so the details he provides in that book. But if you go look at Digital Hammurabi, you'll see a lot of that material. You'll see a lot of other scholars, from Egyptologists to Assyriologists to Old Testament scholars, all kinds of people that have very amazing contributions to all these fields. And they interview them and they ask them questions and they have them present what is known and what about these theories and it's fascinating, and you will learn a lot. But I understand people might not be into that. So I wanted to do this episode to go like, let me just show you a little bit of how what we know about the Bible does not match the popular view of the Bible. If you ask most people, the popular view is, well, everyone knows it's the Word of God and special and somehow different. That's why it's lasted so long. And then the scholarship would be like, well, no, there's other factors that cause it to enter as this central thing in our society. There's ancient literature that found the basis of societies that lasted so much longer than ours has, so far, like thousands of years, and ours is like nothing. So like, it's an amazing thing, and it's important because we find ourselves, unfortunately, in the 21st century still believing fairy tales and doing terrible things based off them. So everyone, Have a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Yes. And I hope Jesus does reign on the throne of David forever, because it's not real. So that's where he's going to be. All right. We'll talk to you later. Have a wonderful, very Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year. We'll be in Disneyland for New Year's. Ha ha.